Okay, well, it's 5:30, I think, and I think we're all ready to get started. Hopefully everybody is with me. Everybody can hear me okay? Can everybody hear me okay? I think this is the first time we've had no, hopefully somebody will give me a shout out here.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, this is not good. I can't hear you. Let me see here. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I can't hear you for some reason. And that's not good. So I don't know what that's about. I put the auto transcription on. So I put the auto transcription on so I can hear, so I can read what you're saying, but I can't hear what you're saying. So gosh, I don't know. I know this is the room that they moved me to has got some older technology, and I'm not sure that I know what to do about this. I'm glad you can hear me, and I'm glad that you can communicate with me, because I know that they're picking up your sounds because it's coming through on the live transcription, but I just don't know what I've got. Let me see here a minute. Oops, wait. Hold on. Let me just try one thing here, and maybe I'll have him come out here. Okay, is that better? Can somebody say something?
We can hear you.
Okay, now I can hear you. Okay, now I can hear you. All right, now I can hear you. Good. Jeez. I was going to say, wow, because they're really getting tired of me already in AV. So anyway, I appreciate that. So, okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. We're sort of right at the halfway point of the course. And so just to sort of bring everybody up to speed, we've got our first exam this week. And as I was sort of looking over the material of what I had sort of thought we would get through up until this point, I don't think we'll get to chapter 12 tonight. I had just a few minutes ago just emailed you all the PowerPoint slide package. I thought it's easier just to email this to you, and you can just download it on your own rather than try to put it into Brightspace. For whatever reason, Brightspace is just not liking PowerPoint slides, and this is a fairly new phenomenon. It's something different, but just thought it's easier to send it to you. In that, toward the very end, there are about 3 or 4 slides dealing with chapter 12, but I don't know that we're going to get to it. If we do, that's great. I'm kind of doubtful. So as to the exam itself, I haven't made the exam available yet because I wanted to see how far we would get with tonight's class session, see how far we can get into it, and it seems to be probably chapter 12 is not going to be part of it, which I'm sure is not any big deal to anybody. So it'll be available in Brightspace as soon as I can make it available. Probably tomorrow. It'll probably be sometime tomorrow, and you'll have through the end of the day Sunday in order to complete it, and you'll have a 2-hour time slice in order to do that. So and what I usually recommend is everybody take it all in one sitting. It's usually the easier way to do it. I don't think Brightspace will let you pause, go out, go back in. It may. I know the old Blackboard system would not. Brightspace, I don't know. I'm not 100% sure. You may very well be able to do it, but I don't really know. You'll have 2 attempts to do it. I think the syllabus said 1 attempt, but I think I'll give you 2 attempts to do it. You may or may not want to avail yourself of that. The highest score will be the one that populates in Brightspace as the official score. I mean, it's a 50 multiple choice question exam. So do you want to sit for it twice? I don't know. I don't know if you have time or whatever. But at minimum, you'll be exposed to all the questions on the exam. The program is set up to scramble the questions, so they won't be in the exact order the second time you see it. But at least you'll know if you're going to do it and think, oh, wow, I totally did not know about this. At least it gives you, whatever amount of time you've got between that first attempt and the end of the day Sunday to say, okay, well, let me just look into this and find out what this is about. Also, I've made available the video recordings of these class sessions to those who wanted them. Anybody who does want them, just let me know if you want to see those again. I've got all of them saved. I believe I can still get into them. I know I've sent those to people who have been absent for various reasons. So those are available if you want to go back through them. I mean, these are long class sessions, I realize. And so I know your time is limited. You've got this class, another class, and you all work and all that. So I know that that is a time constraint. I'm just simply saying that we've got until almost a week really to get prepared for this exam, which is worth a fair amount of your final grade. So I want to make sure that everybody is as prepared as possible for that. Okay, so let me know if that's what you want to do. Also, I know that I mentioned last time that I was a little bit concerned that there were a number of class members who had not participated in the discussions as of the first couple of weeks. And so I said, look, if you can get them in by Thursday of last week, that'll be fine. You know, for the first 2 weeks. And so I actually let you do that through Sunday because, and in fact, I'm sorry to say that I think there are still who are not participating as of week 3. So I just have to tell you, there's not much more I can do other than just to remind everybody that this is a part of the class, the final grade. It's a really fairly straightforward activity, and the grading is not overly rigorous. In fact, since I've extended the due dates, the dates are not that critical either. For at least those first 3 weeks, I've sort of given a little bit of flexibility too. But it's always been built into this class. Even when we met in class in person downtown, and we had it was always intended to be a hybrid course with online activities as well as in-class activities. So just make sure you can do that going forward. The lowest of those weekly discussion scores will be dropped from final grade. And so you've got that going for you. And at first I was a little bit reluctant to even start grading week 1 because I thought, well, maybe people are just going to take that as a dropped week and whatnot, and get their feet wet with reading the book, because I didn't really assign very much in the first week in terms of reading material. But I'm not 100% sure everyone is getting through on that. So I'll be reviewing those during this week, and if you do have questions about them, just let me know, and I can give you some more input and feedback on those. There's a lengthy discussion guidelines, a link inside the discussions area and of course content discussions. It kind of tells you what's being looked for there. So that's relatively straightforward. So, okay. So questions for me about any of that? Okay, well, and don't feel shy about speaking out, just because I know we have had you limited in the first 2 class sessions. So you should be able to to hear me okay, and I can certainly hear you now. So we should be good to go. We are going to pick up from where we left off last time. Also, I've got the auto transcription on. I think I mentioned this at the outset, and I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I do have the tendency to mumble at times. I do recognize that. So, and to talk a little bit fast at times, and so I recognize that as well. So the auto transcription does a pretty decent job of picking that up. So if that helps you, you can view that. I'm the kind of guy who likes to even turn that thing on, even watching TV at home. So I like it, but if you don't like it, you don't, it's just sort of ignore it and go on from there. So I think last time we left off by talking about unemployment, which goes back to, I think it's chapter 8, if I'm not mistaken. Let me take a look here. Chapter 8, no, it's chapter 9, which deals with unemployment and inflation both. And we're going to finish talking about both unemployment and inflation. Those are pretty important topics at all times, really, in economics. And one of the things that I have been saying before in the class is that macroeconomists love these automotive metaphors to talk about macro policy. And one of those automotive metaphors is the idea of steering between the 2 twin perils that always exist. There's a ditch on this side of the road that's unemployment and recession, and there's a ditch on this side of the road that's excessive growth and inflation. And right now it looks like we're moving more toward this ditch because we've got really pretty serious inflationary pressures going on. And so we're going to talk about that after we finish talking about some unemployment. But it's interesting because for years and years and years, we really weren't talking very much about inflation. It was almost like a historical artifact that, back in the day, there was an inflation. Here's what it was, here's what happened, et cetera. But we've got it again, and we had the Federal Reserve, was it last week, I think, raised interest rates for the first time in about 4 years. And 4 years ago, it was not much of a move even then. It was pre-pandemic. they were trying to normalize rates after what had been really close to almost 20 years of super low interest rates. And this has resulted in a lot of economic growth, and fortunately without inflation. But now we've got the inflation and we've got pretty good growth. But that is probably not going to be the story in about a year or two, because I think even the Federal Reserve is talking about another 11 increases to the interest rate. So, and when we say the interest rate, we'll be more specific as to what that rate is. It's called the Fed funds rate, which is it's the short-term borrowing rate between banks. We'll talk about all that a bit later. But let's finish up talking about the unemployment bit. And I'm sorry, I've still got these allergies I'm just dealing with. I think a lot of you are as well. So it's they kind of flare up at times. So we talked about how to compute the unemployment rate. We said we take the number of unemployed divided by the labor force. So it's simply the number. Oops, that pen's not working at all, is it? Number of unemployed. And these are just simply numbers here. The number of unemployed. And how do we know who these people are? Well, there are a couple of different ways. Number one, those who are unemployed tend to file for unemployment benefits if they're eligible. Those who are ineligible are typically those who voluntarily leave their job. Even then, that's a little bit, in some states, I mean, even though the federal uninsurance program is a federal program, the states administer it, and some states are a little bit more vigilant on enforcing that whole issue of voluntary versus involuntary. Sometimes it's not always very clear. There's one. There's also something called the household survey. The household survey is basically a telephone survey of, well, people's houses, and asking who's employed, who's not employed, et cetera. And from the sample, extrapolating it to the larger labor force. That's becoming increasingly more difficult. We're definitely seeing that in politics, where the polling, at least for the 2016 presidential election, had Hillary Clinton overwhelmingly winning the election. Of course, she did not win the election. And one of the explanations for why the polling was so vastly off is the fact that fewer people have landlines, because they don't really poll on cell phones. And it's a different demographic, maybe an older demographic that has landlines, and because a lot of younger households often do not. So the household survey likewise is probably handicapped in that regard too. Number of employed divided by the labor force, you're going to end up with some ratio. Let's say it's 0.055 or whatever. If you multiply that by 100, then you get a 5.5% unemployment rate. Really, the reason you multiply it by 100 is simply to move the decimal 2 points to the right in order to make it a percentage. So it's expressed as a percentage. Also, this is where we left off. It's also, there are about 9 different unemployment rates that the government publishes. A lot of it having to do with the definition of the labor force, based usually on age. That's the big issue there. Sometimes this will include 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds. Sometimes it'll include only people up to 64. Sometimes it'll include everybody who's eligible to work if they're alive and working at all. So it really depends. But the one that is most often published is what's called U9, okay? And that's the one that is the most comprehensive, okay? All right, so let's talk about the types of unemployment. And I've got a slide. This is from last week's. We're still about maybe half a class session behind. This is not anything particularly fatal, because when the course was designed quite some time ago, we worked into the time frame exam taking, and so obviously you'll be doing the exams at home, so that doesn't cut into our class time at all. So we should be okay, even though it looks like we're maybe just a bit behind. But if we are, that's no big deal. Plus, we frankly lost a little bit of time with these technical issues, which I do apologize for, but it is unforeseen, and it's sort of is what it is. So. Okay, so types of unemployment. So unemployment is not all the same. And by the way, I want to reiterate one thing that I had mentioned last week, I believe, excuse me, is that when macroeconomists talk about unemployment, what they're oftentimes referring to, not always, but oftentimes referring to, is unemployment of all inputs, of all productive resources, of which labor is one, but also sort of paralleling and mirroring the rise of unemployment or the fall in unemployment, whichever it is, of the labor force, is that which affects capital goods as well. That is machinery and equipment and plants and whatnot. So it means that plants that were operating at 3 shifts a day, maybe you're down to 2 shifts or 1 shift or whatever. If you had a fleet of 200 semi trucks, maybe only 150 are actually hauling freight, the other sort of idle or maybe up for sale or whatever. And that would be the individual level. And by the way, there is a measure within the economy called capacity utilization, where we measure the extent to which facilities are being used up to their maximum. And about 85% is considered to be the maximum, mostly because equipment needs to be, and plants need to be updated, maintained, repaired, parts replaced, cleaned, all that sort of thing. So capacity utilization is something that is measured, and that's really a reflection, it's a parallel reflection of labor unemployment, okay? So I just wanted to sort of put that out there, even as we pivot toward talking about only labor unemployment, and when we talk about the types of unemployment, because when the average person talks about unemployment, they're obviously talking about labor unemployment. But yet we should be clear there are really three kinds of unemployment. And in some textbooks and some discussions, you might see a fourth that's more of a seasonal variety, but we're going to put seasonal in the first category that's known as friction. And so what's the definition that I gave in the slide package from last week? It's unemployment due to incidental reasons. Incidental reasons could be whatever, you pick your reason here, as long as they don't sort of verge into the other two. This is sort of the catch-all category. It's where you would put the kind of unemployment that doesn't really fit anywhere else into this, because when we say frictional, it's usually a timing issue where oftentimes somebody's leaving a job and hasn't found another job right away, or maybe has graduated from a program of study or whatever, or training, and is yet to find work. And it's mostly the frictional aspect comes from a time frame. That's really what's going on there. By the way, if you'd rather type me a note in the chat box, that's the reason I came over here, was to see just the architecture of this room, is I can't see the chat box. But if you do put a note there, feel free to, if you'd rather do that rather than jump in, although you're free to jump in as well. So frictional really has to do with all kinds of reasons why people are unemployed, incidental reasons. So what we're going to do here is talk about what some of the examples might be. And I don't know does anybody have any ideas of what might be an example of frictional unemployment? That is somebody who's out of work for, just some incidental kind of reason. Any idea?
A lot of people were out because of the pandemic.
Yeah, pandemic related. So it could be a temporary layoff. It could be a temporary layoff. And that would be one example of a pandemic related. It could be pandemic related. It could be all kinds of things. And by the way, and that's a really good one to have mentioned, this idea of layoffs in general, because layoffs themselves have all kinds of reasons. And I want to be very clear about the idea of layoffs in general. I mean, first of all, who knew we were going to have a pandemic as of a couple of years ago? I mean, I didn't see this on the screen, and I don't know that anybody did. And that's, so the nature of layoffs sometimes is the fact that it's not really necessarily due to the number 3 cause, which is what we call cyclical unemployment. And we'll get to that here in a few minutes. But it's the idea that layoffs can happen for all kinds of reasons. So something like a pandemic could happen, or a natural disaster, or whatever kind of reason. And by the way, when we say that it's sort of independent of, and sometimes not even tracking along with the broader economy, even in the best of economic times, firms can lay people off. You can have a firm that's doing great guns, making tons of money, but decides to lay workers off. And one of the reasons why they do that is simply because maybe those workers are producing goods that are becoming obsolete. There was talk a few years ago about the Intel plant in Rio Rancho that was possibly going to close, and there was real talk about that happening because they were saying that the plant was making older products that are no longer in demand. And I haven't heard any more, but this was a real discussion that they were going to move everybody over to, I think, Gilbert, Arizona, where they built a gigantic new facility, and it was going to be better situated to make whatever the new products are. I don't know what's happening, I don't know if anybody else knows about that. I don't actually know anybody right now who works at Intel. So I used to know some people there, but they're no longer there. But that would be an example. Intel's firm that makes lots of money, has been blowing great guns. Yes, they've got competition, no question about it. But they could lay somebody off, even in the midst of prosperity, macroeconomically, as well as within the firm itself. So firms will lay people off. Also, sometimes firms will just lay people off because they've replaced them, with foreign workers. We've seen that happening. And this whole idea of outsourcing is one that certainly has come about. You could maybe say this is an example of number 2, structural. But it's been going on for so long that I don't know that structural unemployment comes about because of something that's happened sort of suddenly, and maybe not occurring ever again. But outsourcing is nothing new. Outsourcing, sometimes it's called offshoring, but that's maybe a little bit more specific to firms that are leaving to go outside of the US. Outsourcing is basically moving production operations or service operations or whatever it is that the firm is doing to somewhere cheaper usually, or has better regulatory controls, that is more relaxed regulatory controls. Oftentimes it's to foreign countries, whether it's south of the border. A lot of companies have gone to particularly some of the border towns like Juarez and Tijuana and places like that. Also, we certainly know that a lot of plants have moved to the Far East, Asia, and Singapore and Taiwan area, Thailand, Vietnam has been a big area for that. So this has been going on for a very long time. It has nothing to do with the worker itself, worker themselves. And so as a result, outsourcing is one of those particular things that would be an example of that. Any others that we should talk about here? Recent graduates would be an example of this. Recent graduates from some program of education or training. It's very often the case that people will graduate from, say, nursing school or, I don't know, medical school, engineering, whatever, and really don't have a job lined up right away. It's very common. I know when I graduated from college, I did not have a job. In fact, I hadn't even interviewed, hadn't even begun to interview, didn't even have a resume. I started, I graduated, and within about a month, I was interviewing, and it took me about 6 months to start working because I got hired about 4 or 5 months after I started looking, and then the program didn't start right away. It was a training program, and it didn't start for about 6 weeks, and so I was frictionally unemployed as a result of that. That's an example of that, and we're going to make the case that this is not really anything to be overly worried about from a policy perspective. Everything in this particular category here. So recent graduates. Also, there's one category here that we should talk about. Temporary layoff. Oh, voluntary unemployment. People quit their jobs. Voluntary unemployment. This happens all the time. Where people quit their jobs and don't have another job. And I know that has always been thought of as being super risky. We were just talking about the pandemic. We've seen quite a lot of that as we've been coming out of this pandemic, which I guess is what we're doing, where we've seen lots of people leave work and with the confidence they can get more work because there are lots of jobs out there right now. A year from now, I don't know that we'll be talking about that so much. In fact, I very seriously doubt it. That a year from now, we'll be talking about all these job openings that are out there. I just don't think we're going to see it. I think we're definitely heading for a slowdown. And I think the government is trying to engineer a slowdown and a so-called soft landing, which they've been talking about forever. It's almost never that soft of a landing because every time the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates, since World War II, we've always had a recession that follows. So it's likely to happen, unless this is different. But the idea in economics that this time is different almost never works out. It's almost always the same story. And it's just a degree of severity. And the recessions that we've had since, I guess, 1990, which is really the last really serious one, 1991, have been short and shallow by comparison, certainly in comparison to the 1980-82 recession, even though the one in 2008-2009 was really, really steep at first, but then it sort of built. It was mostly just due to a financial shock and banks were freaking out and housing was out of control and whatnot. But if you look at the dip in the economy, it was really sharp. We had a bump in unemployment over 10%, but it didn't last very long. It recovered somewhat quickly. It was a fairly slow recovery overall, but the worst of the worst didn't last all that long, as opposed to the 80-82 recession, where we had double-digit unemployment for month after month after month after month. It just didn't get any better, and nobody seemed to have any answers. And that that was a difficult issue. But people leave their jobs for all kinds of reasons, voluntarily or involuntarily. People quit. I know that a lot of you all work, and so you probably see people quit all the time, and it just happens. And by the way, in economics, you'll see this phrase, you may even see it in your textbook, that workers demand higher wages. And we're going to sort of get into this in chapter 12 a little bit, where we say workers demand higher wages. And it's not really ever always made clear what that really means, because it makes it sound like workers are going to the office and pounding on the desk, telling the boss that they want a raise, or they're out with pitchforks and torches and that. And that's not really it so much, and not even organizing in a collective bargaining sort of fashion. But it's rather they vote with their feet. If I don't get a pay raise, I'm gonna go somewhere else. And employers understand that if people start leaving, and these are people that don't want to leave, then they'll have to raise wages. And I am convinced that that's why Walmart a few years ago decided to do a general increase in their wage rates, is because they had just so much turnover. And in fact, the last time I was in Walmart, I don't know if I mentioned it to this class, but they got a table like right up front with the jobs that are opening. And some of them are very entry-level jobs for about $15 per hour, which, a lot of people are clamoring for that as a minimum wage. And some people are saying that's too high as a minimum wage. That's a never-ending debate. But that's not, if it's a full-time job at $15 per hour, that's about $31,000 a year. And I don't know what the benefits situation line up to be. But as an entry-level position, that's not, I've seen worse. And obviously we've got some inflation, so that kind of waters down the wages. But that's an example of the fact that the market right now has very low unemployment, and a lot of people are leaving to take jobs elsewhere. So temporary outsourcing, recent graduates, voluntary employment. What else am I missing here? Oh, here's one. I'm going to put this in quotes because it sort of sounds, I don't want to make it sound like it's only limited to married people. Trailing spouses. Anybody know what that term refers to? Even though people don't have to be married to be don't have to be a spouse to be part of this. Anybody want to take a shot at that? Well, it's what you might think it is. It's somebody in my last fast track class called it, what they call it, the second body problem, which I never heard of before. It's the idea that one spouse takes a job, or one whoever, whether it could be your mother and you live with your mother and you want to go where your mother is going. It's usually some geographical relocation because of work, and somebody else wants to go along with them. And so as a result, that person is unemployed while the other person has some sort of job somewhere else. And so they're trailing, but they want to stay with that person. And so they're unemployed for a bit. And I know that we had some people down the street from us who are friends of ours, and she was a doctor at UNM Hospital, and he was an engineer at Sandia. And she was originally from South Carolina, and she wanted to move back home. Her parents were elderly. She wanted to go back home. She could find work as a doctor anywhere, and South Carolina certainly needs doctors like everywhere. Well, her husband was some sort of, I don't know, whatever they do at Sandia. And he was a little bit concerned. In fact, I don't think he found work for quite some time. And he was definitely trailing. He definitely did what, and in fact, there was debate about whether or not he would actually be trailing or not. But he ended up going along with her, despite the fact that it was definitely an unemployment situation for him. And we're going to talk about unemployment or employment. That's not actual unemployment, but that's less than ideal employment. So we'll get to that. And we'll also talk about what these mean in the context of policy and what we should say in terms of worrying about them, okay? Second one is structural. So structural unemployment, this is probably the most difficult from a policymaker's point of view. So the definition of that is that it's a mismatch between the skills of workers and the demand for those particular skills. So whatever the workers who are structurally employed, whatever attributes they've got, they're no longer in demand. And so as a result, they are having difficulty finding work. And so what are some of the examples of people who are structurally unemployed? And that is where their skills are no longer in demand. And so as a result, they're no longer in demand. Anybody have any ideas on that? Well, I'll give you one here. Those replaced by technology. This has been the story of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, all the way back to the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The idea of people's jobs excuse me, being replaced by technology, and where capital goods have replaced whatever their labor inputs are, and so as a result, their jobs no longer exist. In other words, obsolete jobs. Obsolete jobs. And there's a long record of those jobs which no longer exist simply because they were been replaced by technology. Telephone operators used to be a job. It's not so much anymore.
Are cashiers like becoming that in a sense?
Yeah, I think so. Cashiers definitely would be an example of that. I mean, we're seeing many fewer cashiers today, simply because of the fact that people can check out of stores on their own. They don't need cashiers to do it. If they're paying cash, they can get change to the machines. When they work, that sort of thing. So yeah, cashiers, those replaced with technology or replaced by technology. So telephone operators used to be a ubiquitous job, not so much any longer. And there used to be, and if you even go back further, there were jobs like elevator operators and people that pumped gas for you. I can remember not too distant past where some people would pump gas for you and check your oil and all that. And I think there are a couple of states where that still is sort of required. They don't want people to do that on their own, but that's for the most part done, since most people just put their card in or run in and say, I want $20 on whatever, that sort of thing. But those jobs are largely gone and they're obsolete. So you could say really that obsolete occupations, really, and I hate to put it that way because it sounds kind of cruel, but I don't know any other way to really say it. These jobs no longer exist because they're obsolete. And even if you go, this goes back to the idea of substitute goods as well. And we talked about substitutes, the idea that one good can be swapped for another, and that's on the demand side. And so think about, why would you need demand for blacksmiths when, in fact, nobody rides horses today, certainly not, around to work and to home and to wherever they're going. I'm not saying nobody rides horses, and there's absolutely zero need for blacksmiths. But I don't think this would be a growth occupation necessarily, being a blacksmith or a candle maker or a chimney sweep. And I got to be a little bit careful with that last one, because one of my classes, somebody had like a mother or brother and an uncle who both made a living doing it as chimney sweeps. And so yes, I know that they're out there, that these occupations, in fact, chimney sweeps, people still burn stuff in their wood in their chimneys and need to be cleaned out. But for the most part, the technology of the output itself is a little bit different. So those occupations no longer exist. Also, you could mention the outsourcing. I'm not going to put outsourcing here, though, frankly. It's debatable as to whether it goes here or here. But as you'll see here in a minute, that it's not really that critical, particularly among these first two. What is most issue here is the fact this is the most difficult to deal with, mostly because the onus is on the worker, and the worker has really got to recognize that things have changed and they're never going to stay the same again. So those working replacement technology, obsolete occupations, the skills are out of date is one issue of structural unemployment. And I'll give you an example here. I have a friend who was a computer scientist and graduated with a computer science degree, moved to New Mexico, and had a pretty good job with the state managing database systems and I think she was a systems analyst and whatnot. And then took some time off because I think her parents were both elderly, and moved really across the country to sort of be with them for a while. I think at least one of them passed away. And so she moved back and then found out that things had changed quite a lot and her skills were beginning to really be out of date, to the point where they said, you know what, you've really been gone for a while. We would rather have you go back and take some more classes and whatnot, or do some additional training. And she was really unwilling to do that. And particularly since it didn't look like she was going to be coming back in at the same level. And then, so if you get out of doing something for a while, you find that your skills are out of date. So I worked in banking for a number of years, and people occasionally will ask me, if I would ever go back into banking. And I said, yeah, I would if it was something really good, but for the most part, I don't know if they would want me because I've been gone so long, and I'm not sure that I'm really up on all the regulations. You know, I mean, I study from this academic standpoint, I study banking, but not on the day-to-day basis where there are regulations coming out all the time, and you've got to keep track of what's happening and whatnot. So I'm not sure that I would, if I were trying to get back into it, I'm not sure that I really could. Not that I'm looking to, but you get the idea. So skills are out of date, they just no longer are really applicable, or the occupation no longer exists. What's most worrisome about this is that because of this, it takes sometimes a while for workers to really understand that their unemployment is a real thing, and that whatever the job they had is probably not coming back. And to realize that is a difficult thing to understand. A lot of the auto workers who've lost their jobs have been replaced by robots, frankly. There's a lot of robotics in auto manufacturing, and those jobs that those robots have replaced, those are not coming back. I don't see any way that they would. And one of the realities of industrialization is that, and I've asked this to classes for years, I said, for the same dollar cost, would you rather have a machine or would you rather have people? And almost always students will say the machines, and that's really the answer that makes sense, because for the same dollar cost with the same productivity, because machines present fewer problems than what people do, frankly. And that puts it kind of harshly. It's not a very humanistic way of looking at it, but you know, they don't need vacation. Yes, they break down and all that, but they don't need vacations, and they don't you know, come into work drunk or stoned or whatever, you know, that sort of thing. So you know, machines do what they do. You know, they're programmed to do what they do. They do it pretty well, and are generally pretty reliable. And so you get the idea that machinery will always replace workers, but it takes some time sometimes for workers to really understand what they need to do is sort of move on. And one final thing here that I should talk about is what I would refer to as regional displacement. Regional displacement, where sometimes the work itself is moving. This is not so much outsourcing here, although it could be, there may be some overlap here. Regional displacement is the idea that firms are moving locations for various reasons, consolidating operations, maybe having 2 or 3 distribution centers that now become one, where workers are saying, okay, we really want you to work here, we value you, all this good stuff, but you've now got to move here because this is where the job is. And if you don't move there, I'm sorry, you know, it's been nice working with you, shake hands, all that kind of good stuff. This happens a lot where, you know, people have to move because of the fact that locations close, people make consolidate operations, this sort of regional displacement. And oftentimes people choose not to for all kinds of reasons. Obviously, if you got family nearby or kids in school, houses that you own, I mean, it's not easy to do that, despite the fact that the younger and younger that members are in the workforce, the more they're likely to do that because they have fewer of those burdens. But also over time, it's not just a function of age, but also over time, it seems like people are more willing to move, certainly than what, say, my parents' generation were. My dad was in the Army for years and years, and for 20 years was moving around. We were all over the world. Mostly he was all over the world, and decided he did not want to move ever again, and decided to work in one place. And got offers to move to Iowa and to other places, and decided he didn't want to do it. And he just was tired. And so, but he already had a job, so it wasn't like he was out of work. But you get the idea that sometimes people don't want to go, and that's why they become regionally displaced. They lose their job, and they're not going to find that same job. It's just not going to exist. If you're working as an insurance actuary in Santa Fe, maybe, and there may be only one company in all of New Mexico that does that, and they've decided to move to, I don't know, Chicago, you're probably not going to find work in that particular occupation in New Mexico. It just doesn't really exist here so much. So that's the second one. What's the third one here? Cyclical unemployment. By the way, I mentioned at the outset that sometimes you might see 4, and one of those is seasonal. And by the way, I should probably just put it up here because I'll put it here under frictional, and that's seasonal unemployment. Seasonal unemployment. Sometimes people will put it as a 4th category, but it's really a frictional thing, because if frictional really refers to the time element, then nothing could be more relevant to the time element than seasonal unemployment. That is those workers who are out of work, and they know they're going to be out of work because the the season for whatever it is they're doing is going to come to an end. So it's whether it's agricultural workers in certain areas, construction workers in certain parts of the country know they're going to work a lot less in the winter months. That's not so much the case around here, but certainly in the northern climates it is. Ski instructors, tax preparers, you get the people who work at Ice Tips Park, those kinds of things. Those would be an example of that. So the fourth, some would have it as seasonal, but I would put it there in frictional. So what's cyclical then? Cyclical unemployment is unemployment due to the overall poor economic conditions. And this is, I think, what a lot of people mistake all unemployment for, despite the fact they may be aware that somebody got laid off, maybe involuntarily or maybe voluntarily, decided to quit, and they might then sort of make that broader leap to making a criticism or a judgment about the economy, whereas not all unemployment is cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is simply due to unemployment due to poor economic conditions. And this is, it's particularly cyclical industries, okay? Particularly to sensitive industries. My spelling's not very good today. Cyclically sensitive industries. And that is those industries that tend to rise and fall with a business cycle. And as a result, there's lots of unemployment at various times. And anything connected to real estate, just as a screaming beacon for this particular type of unemployment. Real estate is a boom bust sort of business. And I know real estate's not just one thing, it's a lot of things. It's not just realty, but it's also, it's not just realty, whether it's commercial, industrial, residential, it's also construction, it's leasing, it's leasing of space, whether it's residential, commercial, whatever. But anything connected to it, particularly things like construction, very much cyclically related. Construction sort of comes to a screeching halt when interest rates get high. And in fact, that's sort of the intent of raising interest rates, is to at least slow down these particularly sensitive industries. So real estate is one of those. Another area of the economy that's very sensitive is manufacturing in general, particularly manufacturing of anything vehicle related, what we would call durable goods, right? So manufacturing of durable goods, in particular, not so much manufacturing of consumer goods, because people are still going to buy shampoo or eggs and bacon or whatever, even if they're laid off, because they'll hopefully be able to survive even during a laid off situation. But they might not buy new furniture or a new car or whatever, or motorcycle or motorhome or whatever. So manufacturing tends to take a fall. Also, in some cases, some financial services are very sensitive to this. Particularly in the investment field, where economic downturns tend to see downturns in things like the stock market. So if you're in the investment business, your business will oftentimes take a hit during poor economic times and only recover as the economy comes out of it. So those are pretty interest sensitive. And by the way, you might be saying, well, wait, what is not cyclically sensitive? And one of the areas that are not cyclically sensitive, because isn't any industry that you think of sensitive to these cyclical ups, downs? And the answer is no, not really. There are some areas that are not particularly sensitive to it at all, like healthcare, for instance, is not particularly sensitive to the economy as a whole. I'm not saying that it's completely insensitive, but it's not that connected to the ups and downs of the business cycle. So at that, government work in some cases, local governments, it's a little bit more difficult, because if tax revenues are down, and we're going to talk about this whole notion of tax revenues as it affects state, local, even national governments during economic downturns, but sometimes you'll see layoffs of teachers, police officers, firefighters, and whatnot. But for the most part, government work tends to not be as sensitive to that. Anybody connected with anybody in the military tends to not be that sensitive to the ups and downs in the economy. Even manufacturing of defense goods is not so much impacted by that so much. So you get the idea that not all industries are the same. You could say retail, but it depends. Retail is a very broad topic as well. Some of these are really, I mean, these are broad. These manufacturing, finance, real estate. These are big areas. So maybe not every area is impacted as much. Certainly in real estate, construction is impacted, but also so is realty. But maybe something like, I don't know, real estate appraising may not be, particularly if people are refinancing because the government tends to lower interest rates during economic downturns, and refinances really take off during those periods of time. So I know when I was in the mortgage business, I had a lot of people saying that they felt like ghouls because they would always hope for bad economic news because it meant for lower interest rates and more refinance business for them. So these are the three types of unemployment. Are there questions about these? We spent some time going over them, but I think it's important to really make sure that we are familiar with what these are, because they really are different from one another, even though there may potentially be some overlap, and there probably is. But here's the thing, in the next slide of that PowerPoint package from last week talked about a policy response to these types of unemployment. So we're saying with frictional, and it's based on the idea of where the problem lies. Is it the worker's problem, or is it the problem with the economy? And I know when I say the problem with the worker, that maybe sounds a little bit insensitive, but all I'm simply saying is that that we're talking about the issue is the burden on the worker. So or is the worker really sort of at fault? So with frictional unemployment, we're saying there's no problem with the worker necessarily. Even though somebody who got fired, there may not be nothing really wrong with that person. They can simply find work doing something else. Maybe that wasn't a very good fit. It happens, Somebody may look good on paper, but just doesn't work out, or they don't like it. They don't like the company culture, whatever. They're perfectly adequate workers. It just didn't work, and so there's no problem with the worker. But there's also no problem with the economy, and we talked about this with regard to some of these temporary layoffs. People will lay people, firms will lay people off at times, and there's really nothing wrong. So there's no problem with the worker. There's no problem with the economy. So there is no policy response needed. So the government really does not need to do anything, because we make a case that there's always going to be frictional unemployment. It doesn't matter what you do. There are always going to be people moving around, jumping between jobs, graduating from programs, leaving one job to find another job, maybe even taking the summer off, putting the job in May to take the summer off and go motorcycling across South America, whatever. I mean, people do that kind of thing. And as a result, they're frictionally unemployed. But it's not something that has to be acted upon as a public policy initiative. So all frictional is that. Structural unemployment, we're saying the problem is with the worker. This is the only one of the three where we say the problem is with the worker. And I realize that's kind of an awkward way to put it, but there's really no better way. I mean, if there's a better way, I'm open to suggestions, I guess. The onus is on the worker to do what? To find new skills, to find new work, and maybe to just simply change occupations. It does happen. But we're also saying, and this may surprise you, that there's no problem with the economy. So the problem lies with the worker, but there's no problem with the economy. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, there is a problem with the economy because people are losing jobs because technology is replacing them, and so they have all these people on the street because they're out of work. But that is the story of industrialization, and the story of the Industrial Revolution, going back, we're in the 3rd century of that, has been a constant upheaval, what we call creative destruction, where jobs are, because technologies replace old technologies. The goods which used to exist no longer exist because they're replaced by new goods, and so all the inputs that went into that have to be replaced. And so people move on; they find something else to do, even despite the fact that there's been we're now into 2.5 centuries of the Industrial Revolution, and we're constantly hearing people worry about jobs permanently being replaced by technology, that robots and computers will do it all. There'll be no jobs for people. And we never have gotten there yet. In fact, if anything, the long-term unemployment rate has gone down, not up, even while our rate of technology adoption has gone up. So those fears have not shown themselves to be true because people are resilient. They find other places to go to work. It doesn't mean they necessarily replace the same wage right away, because if you have to change careers, you oftentimes start out maybe at a lower level than what you were previously. That's not good, but that is sort of reality. And we're saying that because of this sort of destruction, which is sort of inevitable, that there's no policy response on the part of government. So you might be saying, okay, no policy response here, no policy response. Tell me there's a policy response here. And we're saying there is, because here we're saying there's no problem with the worker. The problem is with the economy. The economy is in a downturn. And so as a result, if you believe the government has a role to play in correcting economic downturns that result in recession and unemployment, then you would find that government should do something. Government should step in, government should lead the problem. Now, to sort of follow up on this, who would believe otherwise? That government should, who would say the government should not do anything? Well, there's an entire school of macroeconomists who believe that government should not intervene in the economy in order to correct downturns, so the economy will work itself out. And we'll talk about them a bit later in the course, and we'll talk about what they're up to and why they believe what they believe. They're called the Neoclassicists, and they believe government really doesn't have a very active role, particularly in solving unemployment. That if you're unemployed, even if the economy is bad, they believe that workers will eventually, who out of work, will take lower wages because the firms that are offering them will only be able to afford lower wages. And as the economy recovers, they'll be in a better position to gain higher wages. They'll get longer hours, they may get overtime, they may get promotions because they've been there for a while. And as a result, it will cure the problem on its own without the need for artificial stimulation by the government. So here we're saying, so if you believe that, then you probably think that policy itself is not going to work, government policy that is. And so there are those who excuse me, who believe that. But if you believe the government's got a role to play, then you would believe that that policy should take the form of intervention. And by the way, I think most people today, and really most people in government, I think believe the government has a role to play and doesn't and do want to step in, particularly among elected officials. But not only among the elected officials, also our monetary authorities via the Federal Reserve, I think feel like they have a role to play. That government is not just some passive actor. Their argument is, what's government for? If we're the government for the people, by the people, et cetera, the government ought to be able to do something when there's a particularly cyclical downturn, particularly a sharp one that goes on and on forever. And the difference really, if you think about the difference between a recession, which is a dip in a temporary dip in output and income, and a depression, which is a deeper, longer depression, a deeper, longer recession, is simply the depth of it. A lot of it has to do with the fact that government has not intervened. And the Great Depression was the last of the big depressions that we've had in this country. And that was a case that it got started by government saying, things are fine, everybody's just calm down, it will get better. The economy is fundamentally sound. That's what the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, had to say at the time. And the economy was not fundamentally sound, and government was needed. And when he was voted out of office and replaced by a very activist President, Roosevelt, then I think the American public sort of has never turned its back on the idea of looking to government for help in lots of different areas. And whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing really depends upon your ideological point of view, which we're going to be covering all of those points of view. And I'm not going to try to indoctrinate the class in any one way or try to influence my opinion at all, other than to say that I think most people would agree that policy intervention excuse me, is necessary. It is effective, even if it's only for a temporary sort of measure, and then to sort of step back. Just like in the pandemic, we had the stimulus checks for a time, and the advanced child tax credit checks for a time, and those are no longer coming. We're not going to get any more of those. There are no more stimulus checks coming, at least in the foreseeable future. So they're pandemic related because a lot of businesses were still not 100% open and whatnot. But now we're sort of moving back to normalcy, at least we hope. Okay. All right. So questions about anything with regard to the types of unemployment that we talked about here. Okay. So I think we'll go to about, well, we'll try to go to about 7, I guess, with our break. And I think that is usually a pretty good time. But I guess the good news for all of you is the fact that you can take off whenever you like if you want to take a break. But I'll probably go to about 7, then we'll take a break and then finish up. We'll try to get at least through chapter 10 tonight. And I am really doubtful we'll do chapter 12. By the way, I used to cover chapter 11 and still do in the classes that go 12 or 15 weeks. It's a pretty good lead into chapter 12, which is assigned around this time too. However, 11 is a very technical chapter. Obviously, feel free to read it. Not that you really want to, but it's a very technical chapter. But it really does lay out a lot of the explanation as to how we arrive at some of the modeling that we're going to be building, and it sort of gives sort of the background, the architectural background of what's going on. But it really, I think, is one of those deals that needs explanation. But because it's sort of borderline 300 level material, I decided not to include it here and in this class, and just because I think there's enough to do in 7 weeks as it is. Okay. So full employment is the next topic here. It's a condition in which those who are available to work able to find work. In other words, there is no cyclical unemployment. So what we're saying is, with the prior discussion, is of the 3 kinds of unemployment, we're going to accept the fact that frictional and structural are here to stay, that whoever is frictionally or structurally unemployed, they will find their way back into working again. They're in the labor force if they're looking for work, because that's part of the definition of the labor force, those who are working and those who are actively looking for work, but that they will find it eventually. And so there's nothing that we really need to do, which is not to say that we won't support them with unemployment benefits and other things like food assistance and medical assistance. Those are all oftentimes forthcoming, but there's no active macro response where we have to spend $1 trillion to try to cure all frictional and structural unemployment, because it's sort of like it's kind of like pollution. That's been we studied that somewhat micro. That's the idea that if we could probably never get to a point of zero pollution. It's probably never going to happen, because as you can, if we took 90% of pollution out of the air or the water, and we did a pretty good job with the water actually, but if we take 90% of the air pollution away, that last 10% is so expensive that it's probably not even worth the actual cost to do that. It's kind of like crime. Can we ever bring crime down to zero? And the answer is, I think, no. And certainly we're not that close to it, are we? But in order for us to do it, we would have to make such a gigantic commitment that what would have to give in order for us to do that. And I don't think as a society that we're ready to do that, to take crime down to zero. There are societies in which pretty much everything's illegal. And there are places you probably don't want to live because they're mostly police states. My brother-in-law lived in where was it? In Singapore, I think, for a short time. And it's a very pleasant place to live, as long as you don't violate their many laws against everything. I think he spit some gum out on a subway platform, and everyone told him to pick it up right away before he got arrested. Not fined or whatever, but arrested. So he did that. So you get the idea. So it's the idea that you can't take this to zero. So unemployment can't be taken to zero either. But cyclical unemployment is under the control of government, because there are certain levers that we're going to be talking about when it comes to what's called stabilization policy. And there are 2 main levers, and I think we went over this some time ago. Fiscal policy, which deals with budget policy, taxation and government spending, those 2 levers. And then the second is monetary policy, which we've talked a little bit tonight about. That's mostly the interest rate mechanism intervening in the money supply in order to control that sort of thing. So that gets us, so full employment is that condition in which there's only frictional and structural unemployment. So full employment is that condition where it's expressed as a percentage, and it's only equal to frictional plus structural. And so, in other words, what's the upshot of this is zero cyclical, right? Is full employment. But then we come back to what's called full employment GDP, which is equivalent to the GDP at which there is no cyclical unemployment. Okay, which no cyclical unemployment exists. So, and this is expressed as a dollar figure. So one is expressed as a percentage of the labor force, frictional and structural. This is expressed as $1. And then here we're saying there's no cyclical unemployment, which exists. Okay, so that's essentially what's going on there. And we should talk about the cases in which these don't equal one another. Okay, and we're going to be introducing this concept tonight, and we're going to be coming back to it again and again throughout the rest of the term, and that is this. It's the case in which the actual GDP differs from the full employment GDP, either up or down, and we say that an output gap exists. An output gap exists. The output gap is the difference between, either up or down, between actual GDP and the full employment level of GDP. And because for the most part, there is a school of thought, which we'll be talking about shortly, that discusses the fact that the economy doesn't always operate at full employment. And we're usually somewhere around full employment, but oftentimes we get knocked off balance, and we end up somewhere very far from full employment. So there are two forms of this unemployment gap, two forms of this inequality here, and that is where actual is greater than full employment GDP. And this is what's known as an inflationary gap. It's called a positive gap or an inflationary gap. And that's where the economy is operating too fast. It's operating at too fast a level, and we've got too much growth, and so now it results in too much inflation. And we're going to talk about inflation here in just a minute, which is sort of defined as just too much activity, too much. So to bring it back to the automotive metaphor and driving the car, we need to slow it down. We're going too fast. We're going to do some damage. We're going to fly off the road, and then we're going to be in trouble. So the inflationary gap is that part of the inequality that's to the upside. To the downside is one that is probably more familiar, and that would be a case of a recessionary gap. And so closing the output gap in either direction is a goal of policy. And it's both fiscal and monetary policy, and we'll be talking about each of those as we get into the second half of the class. A lot of that second half deals with macro policy and what to do when the economy is out of balance. And this is certainly, you've got this inequality here between actual GDP, full employment GDP, again, Y being the symbol for GDP. And so as a result, you've got this inequality means that we should try to bring it into some sort of balance. And we'll talk much more about what specifically can be done as results, either of those. So one is a positive gap, one is a negative gap. Positive, negative, also known as inflationary, recessionary, same thing, okay? All right, so questions about that before we sort of wrap this up. I want to talk about some of the problems with unemployment and some cases of some alternative experiences with employment that might not be the same as what everybody might experience. And then we'll get into the inflation bit, and then we'll probably take a break, and then we'll be ready to start chapter 10, which deals, the title of chapter 10 is basic macro relationships. It's where we start to build macro models, and these are the models that we're going to be building and working with throughout the rest of the term. And so that's right about the halfway point. So we really are pretty much where we ought to be at this point. So, okay. So questions about any of this so far? Okay. Well, if you do, you can always feel free to give me a shout out. This room is kind of weird because the screens are flipped the other direction. So I've got to actually physically walk around to see if anybody's got anything in the chat box. So I don't see anything, but I can't hear you. So it's probably easier for you just to shout out. It's probably the best thing to do. So let's talk about what some of the problems with unemployment are. And I don't mean to present that like, I mean, because I think we all know what problems are, that unemployment's a bad thing. And again, we're talking about labor unemployment specifically here. But I'm going to present this from the standpoint of, what if you are somebody who thinks unemployment's not a problem? Because maybe you work in an occupation that's particularly not sensitive to ups and downs in the economy. And so as a result, it doesn't matter to you. Maybe you're retired. Maybe you are somebody who works for the government and has never had a layoff ever before. And why do you particularly care? And I'm going to sort of make this relevant to the idea that everybody ought to care, and here's why. Because these are the things that affect everybody as a result of others being unemployed. So let's talk about what some of these are. And these little arrows in these first two mean that one thing leads to another. And that is, the first issue is, almost by definition, lower personal and disposable income. If you might remember from last time, personal income was defined as the portion of GDP from the income approach. Remember, we have two ways of computing GDP: the expenditures approach, that is from the demand side, and the income approach, that's from the supply side. including the supply of labor. And so household earnings are part of personal income. And then taking taxes out of that means that's disposable income. And those by definition fall during downturns in the economy, resulting in unemployment. So those decline, but so do taxes on those earnings. So as a result, lower personal taxes. Also, you're buying fewer goods since you're paying less sales taxes. Sales taxes flow to state governments. And so as a result, here's the problem with that. Government's being asked to do contradictory things. So as a result, you're asking government to step in and help those in society who need help while depriving the government of the resources needed to provide that help. And this is particularly true with state government and local government, which is an extension of state government. Unlike the federal government, which we can print all the money we want if we need to, there's no problem with that. The states don't have that ability. We don't have our own currencies. And what's more is a lot of states, including New Mexico, cannot run a budget deficit. We have to be within a balanced budget condition, or we can run a surplus and then put those funds aside for it. We can escrow those funds. We're allowed to do that, but we can't go into debt in order to just fund normal operations. It's not allowed. And a lot of states have that. So as a result, a lot of these state functions are hamstrung. And this is why we see during downturns layoffs of police officers and firefighters, because they can't be afforded because the funds aren't there. Why? Because there are less revenues flowing in, particularly from sales taxes and from state taxes, state income taxes, which are down as a result. At the federal level, we see people pay less in income taxes. And as a result, we're asking government to step in and fund programs to help cure unemployment while depriving them of resources. So we're asking contradictory things of government, and we're asking them to do more with less. And that's always a difficult proposition. It's often difficult for long-term unemployed workers to reintegrate back into the workforce. We saw this with, and we talked about this a bit, excuse me, with the structural piece, where if you're out of work for a while, it becomes really hard to get back into work because your skills are obsolete. And there are other issues as well. And that is this whole idea of explaining to an employer why you haven't been working for X number of years or whatever. And I guess here it's probably easier in some cases today to say, well, I had children or whatever. And frankly, this is the way it is. I think probably a lot of employers would be more willing to accept women who had children who took time off than they would men. Frankly, I think that's still sort of a bit of prejudice that might still exist in the workforce. So men might have a tougher argument to say, well, my first child was born, and so I took a couple of years off to be at home. That might not be acceptable to a lot of employers for whatever reason, whether that's right or wrong. There are a lot of things employers do that aren't necessarily right, but they do them. Another thing is, and I can certainly relate to this as an employer, former manager who's interviewed a lot of people, looked at a lot of resumes, where there are gaps in the resume, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, whatever. And you have to wonder, what were you doing? Why were you out of work? And sometimes the question arises, were you in jail somewhere? And what's it going to take for me to figure out if you were, what for, and whether or not, if we hire you, you're going to be able to get bonding, and whether your fingerprints are going to come back as a problem or whatever. Should I be thinking this? Maybe not, but they are thoughts that go through people's minds. So in a close call, if you get a worker quickly, you may pass on that particular worker just because of gaps in the resume and questions about what's going on. Were you in rehab for what exactly? And it's usually we're thinking more of like drug and alcohol rehab, which happens. I mean, these are illnesses. Drug and alcohol abuse is more of a physical thing than it is a behavioral thing. But nonetheless, that stigma still exists, and maybe there shouldn't be that sort of discrimination, but I could tell you that there is. And a lot of employers don't want to take the chance because they're worried. Even if you did say, hey, I was in rehab for 3 months or whatever, they might not take a chance because they worry about relapse. Should they do that? Maybe they shouldn't, but it becomes difficult the longer you've been out of work. Also, this is going to become a common theme throughout the rest of the semester. It affects lower income households much more than higher income households. This may be completely obvious in the case of unemployment, but we're also going to see this as a recurring theme with inflation as well. Almost any macroeconomic problem is going to impact to the downside negatively lower income households much more than higher income households, which means it's probably better to have a higher income than a lower income. But you didn't need me to tell you that because that's pretty obvious. I'm not going to win a Nobel Prize for that conclusion. But the reality is that lower income households have fewer options. If a major earner in the house is out of work, they tend to have less savings. And we'll show graphically how that's even represented here, less savings with lower incomes. But less savings to fall back on, and more decisions have to be made very quickly. And whereas higher income households may have quite a lot of savings built up, and it may not be that big of a deal. In fact, I remember when I was in banking, we had a bunch of bond traders and we laid a bunch off. And a couple of them, were unattached and not married, no children. And they were actually a little bit happy because they were going to take some time off and whatnot. And that sounds like a weird reaction, but it's possible when you've got that thing to fall back on. That luxury does not exist in most cases because most households we would classify as being in a crisis zone with that happening. That's a bad place to be for most households. And higher income households, not so much of a situation. It affects minority groups much more than non-minority groups. We know this from labor economics, which is more of a subset of micro, because of the fact that minority groups tend to have higher unemployment rates in general and lower rates of rehire in general. In addition to the fact that labor economists still, with current studies, point to lower rates of promotion and whatnot that still exist. And we know that there still are gender wage gaps that exist. And so race and gender have been the two big delineating factors that have been bases for discrimination. And so it still does exist. Yes, there's been progress that's been made over several decades, but it's not 100% there yet. So as a result, that's a disparate impact on not everyone's affected the same when it comes to demographics, no question about it. And then one that I think is really interesting, and from this, if you bring this back to economics and social science, is that it's really associated with numerous social ills, that is family stress and psychological problems and substance abuse. We know that alcohol, for instance, which is much easier to the consumption and demand for alcohol is much easier to measure than it is narcotics, which is a black market activity. The estimates of the size of that market are, I've seen them all over the place. I have no idea what the size of the narcotics market is. And it's not just, there's not just one narcotics market anywhere, it's subdivided into different segments anyway. But alcohol is pretty easy to measure because it's a legal drug, frankly, and we know that's an inferior good. And we define inferior goods as those which demand goes up as incomes fall. We see this happening again and again and again, where people probably are self-medicating and consume more alcohol during unemployment and periods of economic stress. No question about it. And not only that, but the strength of this is so powerful that even in good economic times, we see alcohol consumption fall. So these are inversely related, which means alcohol is mostly an inferior good. That is, it moves opposite the income cycle. And so, in fact, I can remember in the 80s when the economy was just booming, and there were a couple of major distilleries that were planning on closing some plants because people were drinking a lot less hard liquor. They were shifting more to, I guess, wine if they were drinking, or they weren't drinking at all. People weren't, and so as a result, it was really hard times for the hard liquor industry. And in fact, I think some of those have never come back as a result of that. So some of those have gone under. So it's associated with a lot of these. Also, there's a friend of mine who's a psychotherapist. She does a lot of family therapy. And she had said to me, I remember it's been years ago, but she said that one of the things that can stress people out more than anything else and cause lots of family stress issues is unemployment. It's one of the worst things that can happen to families is a major earner being unemployed. All the feelings of self-worth issues that come about and questions about one's value and all that and role. It's a really bad thing. And if you couple that with the fact that it's also associated with a loss of assets, homes and cars and whatnot, this is really very bad from just a social standpoint, regardless of how we do all the fancy math and all this. People losing houses, losing cars and whatnot, losing marriages. I mean, it's really a devastating impact. So, and all of these then can result in all kinds of other sort of abnormalities that we see. There's more alcohol consumption, there's more drunk driving, more of these accidents happen as a result of that. There's more violent crime. A lot of violent crime is tied to alcohol and drug consumption, or the business of alcohol and drug consumption, particularly drugs, certainly. And some of these probably would not happen without the influence of those drugs. And so if you go back to this question of why do I care about unemployment, then this is an attempt to seek to answer those particular questions. Okay, there are probably some others as well. And again, these focus on the household impacts of those. Are there any others that I'm missing here that I should be thinking about? If there are, that's fine. You can maybe think about those on your own. So let's talk about. If I'm going too fast, let me know. But if I'm going too slow, let me know. Let's talk about underemployment, because this is one that is difficult. It's not really even unemployment at all, but it is related to employment, and it also relates to this whole idea of ups and downs in the economy. And when we talk about underemployment, this is, in some cases, I think a lot of people who study these issues are as concerned about underemployment as they are unemployment in a lot of ways, because it's the case of really there are two main forms. There are probably some others as well, but these are really the two main ones. And that is workers who were out of work at one time, so they were in that unemployment numerator of that unemployment calculation, but then find work, and so now they're no longer considered unemployed at all. And unfortunately, we're not like, caribou that we can tag and track around, all of us individually, and so we can follow people around. It sometimes seems like government is following us around, but they're not really that closely. So if we're working, we're no longer counted as unemployed, so we're not really looking at that as part of the unemployment problem. But if you're full-time and now you've got a job working 20 hours per week, in other words, you're part-time, you're still employed, but you're not unemployed. So as a result, that does not show up in the unemployment records because you're back to work. But you may have all the issues with part-time employment that part-time employment brings up: lower wages, probably even lower hourly sort of wage too, because those tend to be based upon an hourly situation. And oftentimes part-time employment almost always involves no benefits or very little benefits, if any. And so as a result, that's a difficulty in itself. And I don't think we talk enough about benefits, because it really is a major portion of total compensation. That whenever we're looking at any kind of a job, you've got to consider benefits, particularly given the fact that healthcare being so expensive now. Healthcare being one of the major costs, and healthcare is just so expensive. And so any kind of compensation you're getting anywhere, you've really got to look at that, even almost really regardless of your age. Even if you're young and healthy, you're only one car crash away from not being that way. And so it's a really important issue. So you could be underemployed that way, but not being counted as unemployed. And also one that's even more difficult to master, and that's the workers who are working in jobs for which they're quote unquote overqualified. And that is people who've got higher skill levels, could do some other kind of work, could earn more, who are working, so they're also not counted as unemployed because they are working after all, but they're not working to the extent that they could be. And oftentimes this is because workers will take jobs during slow economic times because it's what they can find, and they want to get a job right away, start working, and will deliberately leave things off resumes in order to do that, because they think, hey, I'm not going to get the job. If I say that I've got a PhD, I'm not going to get a job as a taxi driver. And because why would they hire me? Because they'll think I'm off to the next place, in a month or so, whereas they really want people who are willing to stay. So leave that off your resume, that sort of thing. And it does happen. It does happen quite a lot, especially during slow economic times. And I know my dad had hired a guy who worked for him as a salesman, and it was during the downturn in the economy. He was a really good salesman, and one day said, hey, I'm going to leave because I got him the job. He goes, oh, sorry to see that. Sorry to hear that. What are you going to be doing? And he said, I'm going to be working as a biochemist at, I think, Dow Chemical or whatever. He goes, what do you mean? A chemist? What? Really? And he goes, yeah, I've got a doctorate in chemistry. And my dad said, I had no idea. He goes, well, you probably wouldn't have hired me. He goes, you're probably right. I probably wouldn't have hired you. So you get the idea that sometimes people will deliberately take jobs because they need jobs right away. And maybe they're unwilling to move. Maybe they've got their own reasons. Maybe they don't want to go back into the occupation. whatever. There are all kinds of reasons. I mean, my sister-in-law is a CPA who just didn't like the job, didn't like the work, which she kind of came late to that recognition, but didn't like the hours, didn't like the travel, and eventually went back and got a teaching certificate and teaches grade school. So is she overqualified? Maybe, but she's doing what she wants to do. So it's not always involuntary. In fact, we're saying that oftentimes these are voluntary situations where people who have got lots and lots of skills maybe are not providing those to the economy generally because they've got higher skill levels. But that's oftentimes a choice. Sometimes it's not a choice. Okay, so those are conditions of underemployment, which are very difficult to measure because we're not really capturing all that well. Okay. All right. So other questions for me about any of that? I'm hoping my voice will hold out for the next hour and a half. I hope it does. Okay. So let's move on to the second part of chapter 9, which deals with inflation. And so again, we say that the two twin evils that macroeconomics is seeking to understand, try to prevent, deal with it, they do occur, is unemployment on the one hand and inflation on the other. And of the unemployment piece, we're saying the only part that's really worrisome is that which is due to the business cycle issues, which the government can use some knobs that can turn and turn some knobs, flip some switches in order to make those get better. Whereas with frictional and structural unemployment, they really cannot. But inflation is also similar. It's a different case, different altogether in most cases, because we're saying that for the most part, you're either in one or the other. You're operating above full employment GDP, or you're operating below full employment GDP, or you're operating at GDP or at full employment. The full employment GDP is the GDP at which there's no cyclical unemployment. Right now, we're probably pretty close to this, if not on the upside in this direction. Even though as we talk about inflation, we're going to say there are really two main types of inflation. And of those, I think that we're looking at sort of a blend of both of those, even though I think if you took this class a year ago, we probably wouldn't be talking about any current inflation. And we certainly wouldn't be talking about one of these as being a cause of that much, that typically a cause of inflation, but now we are. So we'll get to those. So let's talk about what inflation is. What's the definition of it? It's really got two definitions. Going back to the circular flow model where we had the flow of goods, and then we have the flow of money. Well, it's defined both ways. Number one, it's a rise in the price level of those goods and services which are being exchanged in the economy. So it's the physical flow within it's the red arrows within the physical flow model, and that's a general rise in the overall price level. When we say it's a general rise, we're saying it's not confined to any one particular good. And I know that a lot of times people will point to things like gasoline. Right now, gasoline is obviously an elevated price, generally over $4 per gallon, a little bit over. And that's higher than what it has been in the recent past, and certainly higher than what it's been historically. And it just so happens that we've got inflation throughout the broader economy, but we've seen cases in which gas has been $4 and higher, where there's been not very much inflation elsewhere in the economy. So you can't really hang your hat on one particular good and say, aha, there must be inflation, because that's not always the case. It just so happens that, by the way, oil prices, which are the raw material for gasoline, they've been going up for the last couple of years anyway. They've been on the rise. So well before the inflationary cycle that we've only really been talking about now for about 9 months, 12 months, something like that, at the most. We're a year ago, we really weren't talking about inflation. In fact, I don't think in my fall semester of the fast track course, we really talked that much about any current inflation. I think it was just beginning to pick up. And we were told that time by the government that it was transitory, that is temporary. And they have since changed their tune on that, because a lot of people, myself included, were skeptical, and we were right to have been skeptical. It was not temporary. It's still hanging around with us. And so it's a rise in the price level of a lot of goods. Now, we can't just hang our hat on one thing like healthcare or oil and say, hey, this is inflation. It's overall. And then by the same token, it's the financial flow that goes in the other direction, where if it's a fall in the value of money. And one thing defines the other, doesn't it? Because if it takes more dollars to buy the same goods, it means those goods are higher priced. but it also means that that good is worth less money than it was a year ago or 2 years ago or whatever. So it's a depreciation of the value of the dollar or the yen or the euro or the whatever. It's whatever the currency is. It takes more of those dollars to buy the same good, or those units to buy the same good. That is losing its value. And over time, we see that currency does lose its value because there's usually an accepted amount of inflation almost always anyway. And policymakers oftentimes want there to be a little bit of inflation because it's almost like, again, an automotive metaphor, it's almost like breaking the speed limit a little bit. If the speed limit is 55, almost nobody drives 55, do they? They might push it to 60, maybe to 65, and you're probably not taking on that much additional risk. Probably not going to get a ticket, probably not going to go flying off the road, but you will get where you're going a little bit faster. So it's a little bit more efficient. Same goes with inflation. You don't know if you're optimizing your performance unless you're pushing the envelope just a little bit. Okay? All right. It's about 5 till 7. Why don't we take a break now? This gives me a chance while we're at break to set up some of the graphs for the price indexes. And so it's about 4 till something like that. Why don't we take a break till about maybe 10 after, something like that. And if anybody has any questions in the meantime, I'm going to be in and out a little bit of the room, but you can certainly leave me something in the chat box. But we'll take a short break. I'm going to pause the video, so if anybody's playing this back, they don't have to wait for 15 minutes. But we'll take a short break, and I'll see you in just a few, okay? Okay, I think we're back, or most of us are back. And so I think I'll pick up. Does anybody have any questions about anything we talked about with regard to the unemployment piece and unemployment, types of unemployment, how to measure it? It's relatively straightforward. I think I mentioned this last week, that the thing about Chapter 9 is that it's not that really all that involved in terms of some of the technical content. I don't think, at least. There's certainly very little in the way of graphing or whatnot, which we definitely will get into as we get to Chapter 12. Well, I mean, even into Chapter 10. So I know for those who like graphs, then maybe that's not such a good thing, but a lot of people, think they're a little bit more challenging. So for those people, maybe Chapter 9 from this point on has not been all that involved in terms of those sort of technical things, but it's just a different way to express economic relationships is by graphs. And we'll get into that a bit more in Chapter 10, which we will get to before we leave tonight. So we've got about an hour and 10 minutes. I think we'll probably make pretty good headway through Chapter 10. And again, as I indicated at the outset of the class tonight, I was pretty sure we would not get to Chapter 12, which is okay, because that doesn't really put us in any bad situation. We've got more than enough time to cover the remaining work that we have to do yet. So let's talk about inflation a bit. We have already sort of covered the idea of how we measure inflation as we use price indexes, or sometimes you'll see referred to as indices, which is maybe a more correct term of use. And there are really three, well, there are actually several different kinds of price indexes throughout the economy. But in microeconomics, we might find an index that an economist could create for whatever. We had an economist in Arizona who put a price index together of copper. I may have mentioned this in the class before, and just measure copper prices in Arizona and just track them based upon some index that was based upon some index value that represents the value of something at some base year. And the base year is whatever year is being used, and you can go out as many years as you like. The base years are usually revised at some point, because if you get a base year that goes way back to 1800 or whatever, that's obviously too far back to go. And so you have all kinds of different issues there as to the prices of goods and all that. So they are updated. And when it comes to something called the Consumer Price Index, there's a reason why we update that, and mostly it has to do with the market basket that we should talk about what goes into that. So what's happening with the three kind of indexes that we should mention here are the Consumer Price Index that measures prices and price changes at the retail level for consumer goods and services bought by consumers. It's based on what's known as a market basket of goods, which is hundreds, thousands of goods that go into this market basket. It's a few hundred, I think, and they're very specific as to what goes into this market basket. It's a hypothetical basket of goods that consumers ordinarily would buy. And includes, it's very specific. It'll include gallon of milk, whole milk or gallon 2%, not a half gallon, not 1% milk, but 2% milk, or paper towels, this ply, this number of rolls, this weight, ketchup, this number of ounces, iceberg lettuce, not anything else, but iceberg lettuce, no more than this. And then the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is part of the Labor Department, compares this and computes all this and does surveys and calls around, does internet surveys and shopping and even goes to stores and looks at prices and takes pictures and whatnot in order to get an accurate view of what price levels are throughout the economy. It even produces things like regional differences in price levels, which are a real thing. We'll talk a bit about as well, the fact that price levels are not the same, because I think most of us would know that a hotel room in New York City is probably more expensive than a hotel room in, say, El Paso or Albuquerque, whatever. Just a different scheme of things. And so as a result, there are differences in price levels. And that's among the criticisms of computing inflation, is that it's not always all that accurate because of that. And we're going to talk about some of those criticisms. So the CPI captures one of those at the retail level, and it's for goods. It could include imported goods as well. So things like bananas and sugar and all that stuff that's imported would all go into that, and coffee, all goes in that as well. The PPI is the producer price index. It's goods at the wholesale level. These are things like raw materials, like things like the value of coal and wheat and things that are produced that are not final goods that they've got more processing on. What's interesting is that the PPI number usually comes out ahead of the CPI number. Well, not usually, it does come out ahead of it. So it's oftentimes a hint as to what's going to go on with consumer prices, because very often these prices are pushed along through the value chain as they reach its final destination. And so as a result, the PPI numbers are often a harbinger of what's going to happen with consumer prices. Lately, with both of these, we've seen increases in both of them, pretty dramatic increases, to the point where inflation, far from being temporary, it's actually getting worse, and has been getting worse for some time. And there's a lot of feeling that the government is definitely behind and it's dealing with it. And we'll talk much more about the Federal Reserve, which is the agency charged with dealing with that a bit later. And there's something called the GDP Deflator, which is really an effort to try to capture all goods and services independent of any market basket throughout the economy. And one of the virtues of this is it takes imports out. Now, why is that a virtue? Well, sometimes inflation can be imported because, particularly things like imported oil, for instance. And oil obviously is a volatile good to begin with, but if it's imported, it goes out of the picture. But there are all kinds of goods that are imported where we import the inflation by bringing the good in. So GDP deflator, and the deflator is simply, well, this is a deflator really, because if you divide this into whatever the current values are, you can bring it back to a nominal value here. And I'll talk more about this specific calculation here in just a second. A deflator is simply a way of taking current prices and taking the inflation out by bringing them back to what they would be at some base level, the same goods, so it's apples and apples, and then accounting for how much of that price is it just the inflation bit, not necessarily the value of the good itself, but the rise of the value and the price of that good because of inflation. So the deflator does that, and the virtue of it is that it captures many more goods across the economy and also tries to take imports out. That could also be considered a downside if, in fact, you think imports are important to account for, as a lot of people do. There's one other thing that we should talk about. There's been an effort to even get more comprehensive than that. There's something called the Billion Price Project that the MIT Department of Economics has been working on for some time. And last time, their website was down last time I tried to get into it to find out what was happening, but it was really an effort using supercomputers and trying to get the tentacles out throughout the economy to get a much better, more accurate read on what's truly happening with inflation. Because obviously just relying upon the CPI alone, and by the way, we're going to spend some time talking about criticism of the CPI specifically, that one particular index. They've all got areas of criticism that have come their way, but the CPI probably no more than others. Has got the criticism coming its way. But the Billion Prices Project, it really seeks to say, look, let's get out of the market basket business. Let's just get out there and get all the goods we possibly can, and we'll just compute them as quickly as we can in real time so we can get a better idea of what's truly happening out there, so that we can account for these differences, And we can sort of make adjustments. If the price of hotel rooms is more expensive in Manhattan than it is in El Paso, then we can account for that particular adjustment very, very quickly. And by the way, the Bureau of Labor Statistics already sort of does that, sort of slices it up geographically and by different city and all that. So that's already sort of being done, but it is primarily on the market basket variety. Okay, so what are some of the oh, by the way, I was going to talk about the deflator. I told you I was going to spend some time talking about this. So any index, and I'm just using the CPI, that retail price index, which by the way is the most quoted. If you ever listen to the news at all, there's any kind of economic news on prices, they're almost always going to quote the consumer price index. It's the one that most journalists are familiar with. It's published on a monthly basis, comes out every month by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it will basically say what was the rate of increase usually the last month, and then they'll annualize it to be what was it year over year, taking into account the last 12 months, where have we been? So it'd be the last, so if we were looking at, say, February, which is the most recent month we have, it would be what have the prices been from February of last year through January of this year. So all of, well, February to February, I guess, the 12-month period. So, so that we can get an accurate, and it's a rolling thing because as new months come on, old months fall off in that 12-month period. So that's oftentimes how it's quoted. But all indexes of all prices, whether it's in microeconomics or macroeconomics, take the current year prices, whatever they are, divided by the base year prices of those very same goods, whatever those are in question. And in the case of a market basket, it's the very same goods in the base year as the goods in the current year. And then taking those prices and dividing by the base year is always set to 100 anyway. It's just sort of set as an index starting point. It makes for easy sort of viewing, because if you have 108 divided by 3, you get 1.08, which means that prices, whatever year this is, this could be 2021, for instance. It doesn't have to go all back all that far, and this could be 2018. Then we know that since 2018 through 2021, prices have gone up 8.3%. So all you do is, if you want to move the decimal 2 points to the right, you just multiply it by 100, and you get 0.083%. Okay, and you get rid of the 1 there, obviously, but or 8.3%, right? 8.3% is the increase since the beginning, since that time period. So since 2001. Now it doesn't tell you, or 2018. I'm sorry, 2018. I keep having 2001 in my brain because it was used for so long as a base year. So it doesn't tell you what 2019's prices were, 2020's were. If you wanted that, you could certainly go look that up. But you could say that, okay, since the end of 2021, prices have gone up 8.3% since 2018. And that's probably pretty accurate, even though we had a pretty hot year in 2021, especially in the second half of that year. But that would be a way of doing it. And by the way, we call these deflators too, because if you take any sort of value, let's say that we're taking GDP, for instance, and let's say we have GDP of $21.5 trillion or whatever, divided by this deflator, and we wanted to take away the inflation, then we would simply divide this into that. We'd end up with something, I don't know what, I don't have a calculator with me, but it would be something less than that because you're dividing something greater than 1 into that. So it would be maybe 20.8 trillion or whatever. I don't know the answer. But this would be what we would call a real GDP figure, using the CPI as a deflator. Because when we say, everywhere in economics, when we say real, we're talking about inflation adjusted. So of this, some of this is inflation. It's not the value of the goods and services themselves compared against some base year. If 2018 is the base year, some of that's just price level increase. So we have to compare apples and apples. We would say $20.8 trillion of output, inflation adjusted. This will be a nominal, this will be a real. The only difference is taking into account the price level changes, okay? And this would simply be the index value of the goods that we're capturing for that. Now, CPI may not be the best measure to use dividing into it, but it's the same methodology, it's the same math. If you're using the GDP deflator, which, by the way, it's also known as the implicit price deflator. It's got different names. It'd be really nice if we could agree on one name for one thing or one variable for one particular kind of thing, but you get the idea. Excuse me. So a deflator is simply to take out the inflation out of nominal values. Now, between 2021 and 2018 might not be a big deal, but if you go back a long ways, this becomes important if you're talking about a long time frame, like if you have older relatives like me, you might talk to a grandparent or whatever who was maybe paid $5,000 for their first house, a brand new house in 1950, for instance. You might say $5,000 for a new house, but you would have to then inflate it, that is, go the other direction to bring it up to what the current price would be. And maybe it comes out to 180,000 today. That would probably be, you would think, okay, nobody would think anything about 180,000 for a brand new house, but $5,000, it doesn't make sense. But if you wanted to compare those two prices, you would have to take into account the fact that there has been inflation in the last 7 years. Okay, so that's essentially how the methodology works with that. And it's the same whether it's the PPI, the GDP deflator, or any other kind of index. Even in microeconomics, if we're taking a price index to just track something, whatever that something is. I've seen wage indexes that would track the wages of teachers, for instance, over time, and say the city of Atlanta. And just finding out how much of that wage is a real wage increase, or how much is just just inflation. All teachers doing just tracking along with inflation, or are they getting real wage increases? That's an important thing to know, because if you're not getting any kind of an increase at all, if there's any kind of inflation happening, you're losing real wages because your wages are not tracking up to compensate for that. So for those workers who are stuck close to minimum wage, and we will talk more about the problems with inflation generally, if they have no way to raise their wage, they're going to be losing purchasing power every year that there's inflation. Excuse me, it's no big deal or it's less of a deal when there's 2% inflation or 1%, which we had for a lot of years and less even. But when it's 7 and 8% inflation, which is what we're seeing, it doesn't take very long for that person to be really losing traction in purchasing power. So, but having said all this, there are some criticisms. And one of the criticisms of the CPI, well, first of all, even though there are different ways to measure prices in different regions of the country and whatnot, it is primarily an urban market basket that is being used. And so as a result of this, it includes some goods that some people will never purchase, and so is not part of their basket at all. Subway fare, if subway fare is in that, it makes no difference to anybody who lives in Albuquerque. We don't have subways, so that doesn't make any difference. Taxi fare, if you don't ever take a taxi cab, if you live in a rural area, taxi fare means nothing to you, or bus fare if you have no means of public transportation. That's a very common feature of a lot of urban areas. Doesn't exist in rural areas at all. Apartment rents certainly are way higher in a lot of urban areas than they are in rural areas. And so there's that sort of overstatement. And that's really sort of the bottom line criticism of CPI in general, is that it tends to overstate inflation. But for some of those reasons, it includes goods that people in small towns and rural areas, which is not as large a percentage as those of us who live in more urban areas, but nonetheless, even those of us in urban areas, I haven't ridden a subway in quite some time, and I've never ridden one in Albuquerque because there is not one here, obviously. So we have buses, but we don't have subways. So you kind of get that idea. On the other side, there are goods that are bought by people who live in small towns and rural areas that will never be bought by some rural urban dwellers, such as things like barbed wire and rototillers and and riding mowers. Those tend to be consumed a lot less in urban areas that maybe have very little space to cut grass or whatnot. If you do cut grass, you don't certainly need a giant John Deere riding mower or whatnot. So there are goods that people buy in those particular areas, or picket fencing and like the barbed wire example. These are things that they differ in terms of the composition of the average consumer's market basket. So the fact that 80% of the consumers live in these what are called SMAs, metropolitan statistical areas, MSAs, doesn't mean that everybody does. So to that extent, maybe we're overstating the rate of inflation because of the fact that apartment rentals aren't just running out of control like they are in San Francisco and New York at the moment, where a lot of people are simply fleeing while they can because of the fact that rents are just absolutely through the roof. It's not to overstate inflation in the sense that COLAs are tied to this index. COLAs are simply the term for cost of living adjustment. And cost of living adjustments are automatic adjustments to some sort of compensation, some sort of annuity that somebody gets, some sort of annual or monthly or whatever benefit. And as a result, if we're overstating inflation, and we're overcompensating people who get that. Now, COLAs are not automatic for most people, particularly those who are wage earners or salary earners or people who work. It's usually retirees, particularly Social Security recipients who get Social Security retirement pay. They get a cost of living adjustment. And now, I don't know if you want to tell a lot of recipients that, hey, you're being overcompensated every time they get an increase in that. They might not like that very much, but there has been lots of talk for a lot of years in Washington that maybe we need to tie inflation to something different, not the regular CPI, because it's thought to overstate inflation, which means that there's too much compensation being paid on an annual increase basis to Social Security recipients. But not too many people elsewhere get it. Federal employees who are retired, I think, get it. So if you worked in federal civil service or military service, you might get that if you're eligible for retirement benefits. But and maybe some private pensions to some extent, but even there, not so much. So but if there are cost of living adjustments, they will be tied to that. Some union contracts, I think, are tied to that, to those adjustments, but not all. It also doesn't account for the substitution effect. That is particularly a feature of the market basket. That is this: if sugar is in the market basket, the price for sugar is just skyrocketing. And remember, a lot of sugar is imported, and CPI includes imported goods. Well, let's say you don't want to buy sugar, instead you buy a sugar substitute, like an artificial sweetener and whatnot, that is maybe not in the market basket. And even if it were, maybe it's not surging in price. For whatever reason, we tax the heck out of sugar anyway, at the trade level. So as a result, maybe people aren't stuck with that price that's in the basket, but it's fixed there. And so as a result, we don't have to buy it necessarily because we can buy something else. Or if the price of iceberg lettuce, which is a perennial feature of the CPI market basket, if it's rising in price, maybe we buy romaine lettuce, which maybe is cheaper. And so as a result, you can see that people have choices, and so they can get around it. It also doesn't account for what's called the discount retail effect, which I think is probably going to have to be updated, because this is a term that was around really when the big box retailers got going and really started dominating retail and really driving out, frankly, a lot of smaller retailers. And we've seen this happen. In fact, now we're seeing, excuse me, not so small retailers get driven out of business, because Sears is pretty much gone, JCPenney gone, right? These were major players. I mean, if you had told me when I was a kid that Sears would be gone, I would have said you're crazy. They were just dominant everywhere. Even little towns had Sears and Sears catalogs. Even if you lived in the middle of nowhere, you could buy from Sears. Just ordering it would be, you get it in the mail, right? Or UPS or whatever. But this idea of a discount retail effect is that cheaper and bigger tends to be the way people are going. And so as a result, people are getting the best deal they possibly can. And as a result, they're getting the cheapest prices. And as a result, when the BLS examiners who are going around, maybe going around to Macy's and getting the price of Nike tennis shoes, size 10 or whatever, I don't know what you figured out. And maybe you get those cheaper online somewhere through Amazon or whatever, or you get them cheaper at Walmart. So again, overstating the index because the goods in the market basket are being overpriced, because people are switching more to those. And so there's been a lot of talk about the idea that that brick and mortar retailing may be going away. And I don't know if it'll be going away, but it has definitely come on hard times. We have seen lots and lots of retailers go belly up, not just the smaller ones. We've long seen family-owned retailers go out of business. And in fact, small businesses that used to exist in a lot of areas, like small grocery stores, pretty much are gone. They just can't compete. Small drugstores, there are a few around, but not very many, not like there used to be. We're seeing this happening. And the only areas where they can really hang on is where they've really got a good service niche. And so we see family-owned mechanic shops still surviving, mostly because I think they're probably doing better on service than some of the bigger ones are. And so to the extent that they can survive that way, that helps them to survive the onslaught of the bigger players. It also doesn't account for the introduction of new goods. And I want to kind of move on here because I'm running a little bit low on time. This is the idea that the market basket is sort of fixed in time, and sometimes goods come out very, very quickly, and they just don't have the time to incorporate it into the market basket. And so as a result, we're missing some of the mix that people would buy. So when iPads were first introduced, and iPods. They were really popular very quickly, caught on quickly, but didn't make their way to the market basket just because it takes time to get it into the mix. So as a result, new goods don't get accounted for. And also obsolete goods tend to be removed, but not right away. And all we're doing is tracking the prices of them. And goods are on their way out because they're going to be replaced by technology. Oftentimes stay in the basket, probably a little bit longer than what they should, until they can be replaced by something else, just because, you know, it is a big deal to go around changing the mix of goods all the time. You just really can't do it that easily. As computing technology improves, that may change. Okay, so introduction of new goods is another aspect of that. And what's the, I've got a couple more here and then we'll sort of move along. Well, and only a finite number of goods in the basket. So there are some differences there that we should, it's not every good is accounted for. That's why the billion price project is really interesting, because it's really an attempt to sort of capture everything to the extent that we can. And it would not have been possible without lots of computing power and lots of connectivity, lots of ability to get information that just simply wasn't possible previously or very quickly. So what are some of the problems with inflation? I'll present this really in sort of a similar sort of, I guess, point of view as we did unemployment. And that was, why should I care about inflation when it doesn't bother me? All I get is Social Security and federal retirement. They're both adjusted for inflation. So it's not my problem. I don't care about, you know, rising prices, for instance, because I will get an increase in my pay regardless of what it is. And by the way, I don't drive very much, and so yada yada, you get that. Well, we're going to make the case that there is something for everybody to worry about, and that is, number one, it creates inflationary expectations, and that is the self-fulfilling prophecy of rising prices. This is really difficult, and it goes to this idea that there's a psychology of consumers and a psychology of businesses throughout the economy that makes inflationary expectations particularly pernicious. And that is the idea, if we expect higher prices, we're going to be building into the actions that we take and expectations of higher wages and higher prices. So if we have certainly seen accusations of business firms trying to actually, in these most recent months of inflation, trying to get ahead of the curve by charging really advanced prices a little bit higher than what they probably would have given their own cost situation, because they want to try to take advantage of it. And knowing that people will just chalk it up to higher prices in general, well, it's inflation, that maybe we can get away with it. So as a result, those inflationary expectations allow firms to get away with charging higher prices. And by the way, it makes workers want higher wages and make them a little bit itchy to move. And so as a result, everybody demands a bit of a higher price. And because of that, inflationary expectations make it difficult to stop. And one example from the 1970s that I think is really interesting was that of the state of Israel, which was a small country then and still is, but had a policy where if the inflation rate went up by 10%, that everybody would get an increase in pay of 10%. And so they had an inflation problem year after year after year, but nobody really worried about it because everybody was compensated for it because they got increases in their wages. And so as a result, you know, yes, it was after the fact, but still, they got increases in their wages, and so nobody was really worried about it. Nobody really dealt with the inflation problem. But we're going to make the case that there are even if you discount the fact that maybe it's a short-run inconvenience, there are some real long-term problems with inflation that we'll get to here in just a second. So the inflationary expectations is a big one, and the whole idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. So much of macroeconomics deals with this self-fulfilling prophecy. What we think is going to happen will come to pass. Which is why political leaders like presidents will oftentimes try to assure us that things are going to be okay, so that we don't do things which are, you know, contrary to the popular welfare, economic welfare. So you kind of get the idea that that is an important thing. Changing expectations is important when people have the wrong idea or the idea that is not as productive as others. Also, purchase decisions are pushed forward, leading to excessive demand for goods. So people, if you know you're going to buy a washing machine in a year or so, maybe you should buy it now because if I wait, it's going to go up. So maybe I should buy it now, even if I have to borrow. In fact, it would make sense to borrow because why should I, you know, the borrowing costs are going to be less than the expected price increase. And so as a result, I should buy it now. I lock in the price now. I have no idea what it's going to be next year, except I know it's going to be more. So I should buy it now, or I should buy a house now, or I should do whatever because the prices are going to be higher, even if it means borrowing in order to do that. Okay, even if it means borrowing. In fact, one of the characteristics down below is it rewards borrowers over savers, and it does because of the fact that the reality is if you're borrowing money in an inflationary time period, what are you really doing as a borrower in the repayment end of it? You're paying back with less valuable dollars. And so you're incentivized to borrow, and repay with less and less valuable dollars down the road, particularly if your rate of interest is fixed and it has no bearing. If it's fixed, then there's no bearing on what the inflation rate is whatsoever. And we definitely saw some benefit of this. I can remember when I started in banking, we would occasionally run across somebody who had taken on a mortgage in the years in which inflation was very, very low and their interest rates were extremely low, and the prices they paid for their homes were much lower than what current home prices were. So they immediately had a ton of equity in their homes, just simply as a result of doing nothing other than what they would have done anyway, regardless of what was going outside of the walls of their home. And as a result, they benefited from it just by being there and having borrowed in order to buy the good that has gone up in value. And the dollars have not gone up in value because they're paying with cheaper dollars. And we would see people with $200 mortgage payments, just crazy low mortgage payments. And we're not talking about living in one of these micro houses. Even those, they would probably be more than $200 a month. We're talking about regular houses. Once it begins, it's difficult to stop, and that's the whole idea of expectations and all that. So it's difficult. Incomes often don't keep up with rising prices. This is important. That even in the case of the Israel example, even if you get an increase, it's after the fact. So even if you do get an increase in pay, some sort of cost of living adjustment, it's going to be after the fact. And that's assuming, first of all, you do get an increase in pay to compensate yourself for the inflation. But you have to finance the higher prices up front and then get compensated on the back end. So you got to figure out what choices to make. Do I cut something out? Do I borrow to finance this? Whatever. So as a result, your options are sort of limited in that regard. And so this was sort of the short-sightedness that a lot of economists were criticizing the Israeli government for, was discouraging people from really demanding lower inflation. So it's after the fact, and even in the case of the COLA recipients, Social Security recipients, they get an increase, but after the fact. And for most wage earners, we don't get something like a cost of living adjustment. If you get a bump in pay at your job, it's usually because maybe it's an annual review period. You get an automatic increase depending upon your performance and all these different metrics. It depends on what the scheme is, that your reward system, but it's almost never presented as a cost of living adjustment. Almost never. It's usually presented as some sort of merit increase, because I think firms want people to keep motivated and to not expect a cost of living adjustment, because maybe if your performance is subpar, you won't get any increase. So incomes often don't keep up with rising prices. Also, those that are the most volatile are food and energy. The problem with that is that they're necessities. And so people have got to have them. And so as a result, they will rise faster in price than other prices in general. We've definitely seen this happen in this most recent bout of inflation. And there's no way to get around buying food and energy, really. And so we're sort of stuck with it. We talked about the rewards borrowers over savers. And we're back to this idea then again of lower income households are affected much more than higher income households, because as we'll see in chapter 10, that lower income households channel more of their income to spending, the spending of which is on higher prices of goods. And so as a result, they're much more impacted by inflation than higher income households, which can channel more of their income to savings. And as a result of that, they're not impacted by the higher prices to the same percentage of their income as are lower income households. And so we again come back to this idea that it's better to have a higher income than a lower income. And we're saying that not to be funny or to be cute, but to simply say what the reality of the situation is, that lower income households really get the short end of it when it comes to both unemployment and for the reasons that we just sort of laid out. Okay. And then finally, and this is where we get into this issue of why inflation should be dealt with. From the sort of the original starting point of the logic of this is, why should I care? Well, first of all, it's going to dilute the value of anything fixed over time. And so if you buy a bond, for instance, and it pays 3% interest, and yet inflation is running at 7 or 8%, by the way, there are a lot of bonds that the bond investments have not been particularly attractive if you've been trying to buy bonds lately, because the yields that you're going to get, the percentage return, is probably less than the rate of inflation, really. And so as a result, if you get a 3% return on a bond and inflation is running at 7%, you're actually losing money in real terms once you take inflation into account. Now, we think of saving as being a way to get ahead, but you're really not, because you're not capturing price level increases, because it's fixed in nature, so you're not gaining. And another element of this is, I know I sort of dealt with this with my parents as they got older, was the fact that they had bought life insurance policies when they first got married sometime in the 50s and 60s or whatever. And I think my mom had like a $10,000 life insurance policy, which at the time was probably adequate. But I don't think anyone foresaw the massive inflation that we had in the 70s and early 80s. And as a result, $10,000 is not really that much for life insurance. And since then, insurance companies have added what are called inflation riders, where the value will go up over time with tracking along usually with the CPI. But you've got to pay for that extra. You got to pay for that up front. So you're actually paying in advance for the inflation that you're going to have to deal with anyway. So even with that, the value of those contracts are still going to be diluted simply because of the fact that they exist. Any kind of a long-term agreement is going to go down in value with inflation simply because the value of dollars is going down. Okay, so any holder of anything is going to be disadvantaged. Okay, so are there questions for me about any of that? I'm going a little bit quickly here because I just want to sort of wrap this up a little bit in time for us to go forward here. And I want to talk about the two broad forms of inflation. And excuse me, I mentioned at the outset that, when the inflationary period first started sometime last year, the government, that is the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, were both saying, well, it's transitory, it's due to supply issues. In other words, it was due to something called cost push inflation, which is a supply issue. It's a restriction of supply. So as a result, goods are not so much available, the prices are going to go up, because if demand is unchanged, then demand for those goods is still going to be there, and they're only going to be met by a shorter supply, and so prices are going to be higher. And that was simply related to the pandemic. We have talked about all the shortages of goods, all the goods that we're trying to come here from other places, and we're slow in arriving, and we're slow in getting to places because there's a shortage of people to unload ships at the docks, and a shortage of truckers to move the goods, and yada yada. We see all these kind of shortages, and but that's sort of back then, and that was sort of maybe the initial explanation. But now the Federal Reserve is sort of changing its tune and saying that a lot of this inflation is the first kind, demand pull, that is the most common form, and that is too much money chasing too few goods. And that is simply the idea that it's outsized demand in relation to limited supply. And a lot of this has been fueled by, frankly, economic growth, higher wages in a lot of cases. And given the fact that a lot of workers have not come back to the workforce, wages are going up for a lot of people. And that's an inflationary condition in its own right, because it adds purchasing power to the economy. That is, it adds to demand, it brings price levels up. But supply has not been able to catch up in a lot of cases still. So as a result, a lot of this is supply related, but also now we've got this added demand pull dimension. So it's probably a little of both, which is why the inflation rate is so much higher than what it's been in the last several years. It's been the highest it's been in 40 years. That's a long time. And it's simply because of this idea that it's what started out really as a supply issue, pandemically related, has now turned into a demand issue because of higher wages, lower unemployment, and all the stimulus the government's put in, and tax cuts and tax credits and whatnot that have been coming our way. So the consumer has been doing relatively well, with the exception of the inflation picture, which is really the big thing that's sort of looming out there is the danger zone, which is why now there are efforts being made to try to deal with it. So anyway, so that sort of does it. We will return periodically to inflation throughout the course, and this whole idea of real and nominal, that these are concepts that come up again and again throughout all of macroeconomics. And so all we're sort of doing here is sort of laying some of the groundwork, and we'll probably every class session going forward talk about unemployment, talk about inflation, talk about real and nominal and all these kinds of things. So they really are foundational to what is going on in macro. Okay, so we got about half an hour. I think it gives me a good chance to punch my way my way into chapter 10, and I'm only going to cover. The reason I wasn't going to really talk about what's on the exam is because I didn't know how far I would get, and wherever I stop is not going to be, whatever I don't cover is not going to be an exam. I don't want to put an exam question there that deals with a question on a topic we haven't covered in class. So, but I didn't know where that would be given how long these classes run, which is why it's not available tonight. It'll be available probably tomorrow, would be my guess. So, okay. So other questions for me about anything? You guys are quiet. I think you guys are shy here. All right, so, well, you can't even say something. It's okay. It's fine. Now I put the drinks on. Now nobody wants to talk. So, all right. So, what is chapter 10 all about? It's titled Basic Macro Relationships. So, what we're talking about here is really it's really sort of building a sort of graphical model of the macroeconomy. That's really what's going on in chapter 10, which leads us into building our first true macro model in chapter 12, which we will get to next time. We'll show what that. But for now, we'll start with some of the basics, and we're going to go back to, in order to sort of build this model, I want to return to the model of GDP that goes back to the supply side. That's the income approach, where if you remember, we started with GDP, we did this last time, and we got to national income. It's basically business income. Then we came down to personal income, and we took out personal taxes, and we arrived at disposable income. And we define disposable income. Sometimes you'll see it reflected as disposable personal income. It's the same thing, as long as the term disposable is in there. What it really refers to is household income that is net of taxes after taxes have been paid. And we made the case last time that there's only two things that a household can do with disposable income. That is, they can channel it into spending or to saving. And spending we simply refer to as consumption. Goods that households buy are consumer goods, and savings. So those are the only two options for what a household can do with its take-home pay. And when we talked about savings, we said that savings is not quite the same savings as maybe what a lot of people might think of, that if you bury it in your backyard, that you might think that's your savings, that's your treasure chest. And I guess to you it is, but it doesn't meet the category of being deposited with financial intermediaries. You probably have this in your notes, and so if you were here last time, you don't need to write this down, but financial intermediaries, and we're going to talk more about them later. And also it's what we would refer to as deferred consumption. The idea being that at some point, this is going to result in spending down the road, but for right now, it's not spending down the road. It's money set aside, usually somebody in the financial part of the economy. And we think of banks, but it isn't just banks only. It could be insurance companies, investment firms, it could be pension funds, it could be savings and loans, it could be all kinds of different actors that might be involved in taking savings. So one thing about this is the idea that savings and consumption are mathematical complements. And that is, we can take the percentage of these and they'll always add up to 100%. So if, for instance, if a household makes $1,000 a month and spends $800, then we know that savings must be $200. And so they're mathematical complements, because the only way that savings would equal zero is if the household spent everything and saved nothing. Given the same, that is the same ceteris paribus, that is all else remaining equal, disposable income hasn't changed. And even if a household were to have $1,000 in disposable income and spent $1,200, then we would still have this being mathematical complements, because we would have a case of negative savings. negative savings does exist. It's a possibility. In fact, it's not all that uncommon for any household or business for that matter, or even government for that matter, to spend more in any particular period than what it takes in. And it's not unusual at all, and it simply is a condition known as dis-savings. It is negative savings. And I know it sounds like I just made that term up, but it's a real thing. And dis-savings is simply this. Dis-savings is any condition of spending in excess of available income to spend. And as a result of this, money's got to come from somewhere. And dis-savings comes from really two main sources. One, it's someone's savings that they can go into. So if you spend $200 more in 1 month than what you received as income, then maybe you tap and move over $200 from your savings. You could do that. Or you could, and I guess transfers would work if you get transfer payments like unemployment benefits or whatever. That would be a potential way of funding that. In fact, let's how are dis-savings funded? So one would be a savings withdrawal, right? A withdrawal from savings. And here I know that we hear the word withdrawal and we think about withdrawal from a savings account. It's simply a withdrawal from any kind of savings in any form, whether it's stocks and bonds, mutual funds, savings bonds, annuity contracts, whatever. And if you take money out of those, if you're able to get to them, you're not locked in, you're able to get out, then it would be withdrawal from savings. And so that's one way to get there. Another way is by transfers. That is, if you can get some sort of relief. And we talked about transfers last time, and we said that transfers are simply one-way movements of money from government to households, and that the household really doesn't have to do anything to get it. That's why it's one way. It just has to be eligible. And transfers include things like unemployment benefits, food assistance, educational assistance. It's not always for people who are even indigent, because there are people who get transfers like Social Security recipients. You could be a billionaire and still get Social Security. Doesn't make any difference. Transfers are one way, though, for anybody to fund a condition of dis-savings. Okay, so it does happen. And by the way, even though it's more common to have in lower incomes to have a condition of dis-savings, it can happen at any income level. It just tends to happen more frequently on the lower income scale, as we will see graphically here in just a minute. Transfers, or what is probably the most common, is borrowing, which is an act of doing what? Every time you borrow, you're actually borrowing from someone else's savings. Now, clearly it's the case if you borrow from a friend or relative, you're borrowing from their savings, where they're temporarily they're deferring the consumption on those funds until they get repaid. So it does become deferred consumption. But if you borrow from a financial institution, you're borrowing from someone else's savings, not directly, but indirectly, which is why it's called an intermediary. But you are tapping someone else's savings to do that. So this is why it's called dis-savings or negative savings, is because it is possible for this to happen, okay? So the mathematical complements, they have to equal themselves, they have to equal disposable income, whatever the case might be. And it's almost impossible. You can have zero savings, but it's almost impossible to think of zero consumption. And in fact, we will see macroeconomically as we graph this, that it's so impossible that we'll even look at negative income and talk about the fact that it could be possible to have that as well, okay? So questions about any of that. So the mathematical complements. And this leads us then, in order to sort of describe what's going on with the mathematics and the graphics of how we understand households in particular. And then we'll sort of blow this up a little bit. This was always a good lead off into chapter 11, which sort of took these fundamentals of households and sort of made them into the bigger macroeconomy. But again, we're not going to cover chapter 11 just in the interest of time. And I usually don't anyway in any of the fast track courses that we do. But these ideas will apply to the broader economy as a whole. So in economics, we talk a lot about propensities. And if you look the word up, propensities maybe not a word that we use a lot, maybe outside of the economics profession, but what is a propensity? It's a tendency or it's a leaning. It's almost a default setting. So if you pull a dog's tail, that dog has a tendency, a propensity to bite you, right? The dog doesn't have to go through any sort of thought process. It's sort of automatic. And so as a result, we're saying these are almost some automatic default settings that exist throughout the economy. And it doesn't mean they can't change over time, but it means that in the short run, at least, however we define the short run, which unfortunately in macro is simply defined as something shorter than the long run, which itself is poorly defined. It's almost like we know it when we see it sort of thing. But there are these tendencies or leanings that are relatively the same in the very short run. So we have something called the average propensity to consume, and that is the, simply put, it's consumption over disposable income. It's consumption over disposable income, but it's going to differ because disposable income is different. So average propensity to consume is problematic because averages in general are problematic. And that is, and we talk a lot about this in micro, the idea of one of the problems with averages. Well, first of all, one problem with averages is that you may have the average of something that there is no individual, it's not representative of anything at all. Just like average household size of 1.3 children. Well, there is no household with 1.3 children or 1.8 or whatever the number is, right? So it doesn't, it may not be representative of anything at all. Also, extreme values throw those averages way off. If you're a church and you're going to base the giving on a percentage of people's incomes, and then suddenly you have a brand new member and it's Bill Gates, right? Well, what is the percentage of his income? It's going to, whatever percentage you're assessing every household of his income will be more than enough to probably pay for all the operations of a church. And so as a result, you have to end up discarding extreme values. So what is better is the average propensity to consume and the average propensity to save are problematic simply because of the fact that disposable incomes are so broad and so varied. But what is interesting is that they're still the same percentages, and they both add up to 1.0. In other words, they are mathematical complements, because if consumption and savings are mathematical complements, then all we're doing is adding the denominator disposable income in both of those, in which case they still equal in themselves. They're still the same percentage. Okay. What is more important is marginal propensities. That's really what we are getting at, and we'll talk a bit more about that here shortly. But right now, let's talk about the consumption function. Okay. So the term function should be sort of a hint that this is a mathematical relationship. Okay. And it really is. So we're going to present this as a mathematical relationship relating what? Consumption to disposable income. So if C plus S equals disposable income, then let's just take the C portion of that and talk about what that looks like. So, and we can say one thing about this, and we already sort of alluded to it earlier, and that was the idea that lower income households have a higher percentage of their income channeled to consumption than do higher income households. So it's just the opposite in both cases. Lower percentage of disposable income with higher households is channeled to consumption. A higher percentage of lower income households channel theirs to consumption, simply because of the fact that lower income households have less money to save. And so as a result, if there's less savings, these are percentages, remember, and most of them must be going to consumption. Even if that consumption is greater than 100%, it's still going to be mathematical complements. They're still going to equal 100 because of dissavings and the possibility of dissavings. But we know this instinctively. We know that households with lower incomes probably don't save very much, and so most of what is earned is consumed, and so it's a very high percentage of disposable income. So it's a high APC, average propensity to consume, whereas higher income households have a lower propensity to consume simply because they've got more ability to save, having covered the basic necessities, and because some people's incomes are just so extremely high that they can't find anything to spend money on. And I remember the book by Charles Gibbons, who was sort of a financial guru who used to be Elvis's money manager, and he said that Elvis had money problems. And what he said was that Elvis's money problems were the money was coming in so fast, he didn't know what to spend it on. He couldn't figure out what to do with it all, where to invest it. And that's why, if you've ever been to Graceland, he just spent it on crazy stuff. And so most of us are not in that fortunate position, but that would definitely be a case of a high income household. And by the way, the Elvis Presley estate is still worth a gargantuan amount of money, the last I heard. He is probably making as much money now as he ever did, having been gone from us for about 50 years. So, all right, so that's the consumption function. What about the savings function? Well, it's because of mathematical complements, everything is reversed. Lower income households have a lower percentage and propensity to save simply because of the very opposite of their ability to channel more to their necessity channeling more to consumption. High income households have a higher propensity to save simply because of the fact that they are more able to do so. And so this gives us then the lead into what are called marginal propensities. Now, here's what's interesting. Now, what does marginal mean? And I want to be clear, when we talk about marginal, what we're saying, because I know that sometimes people use the word marginal in everyday speech, and they may mean it to be small, insignificant, irrelevant, maybe, and that might be true and accurate. What we mean in economics is incremental. That is, as we go from one level to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And that's what marginal really means. If you think about our income tax code, it's called the marginal tax rate. That is, if you're, let's say, a single filer, the first $25,000 you earn as taxable income might be taxed at 10%. And the next 20,000 at 20%. Still the original 25,000 at that lower marginal rate. As you go from 25 to say 40,000, it's taxed at 15%, and the next say 15,000 at 20%, on and on and on, that sort of thing. And so it's a progressive tax rate. And we'll get to that a bit later. But it's the idea that it's those incremental, as we go from one incremental level to the next, that's what's really going on. That's what we're most interested in. Because why? Because we're not, the averages are misleading for reasons that we talked about before. You can have these wild outlying characters like Bill Gates or Elvis, and where they're totally out of sync with everybody else, and so as a result, they're real outlying characters, but they would be included in that. Well, marginal propensities take into account the entire economy and what the entire economy is likely to do. And it's important from a macro policy perspective to know what is the propensity on the margin for an extra dollar of income. Where is it going to go? Is more of it going to get spent? Is more of it going to get saved? If more of it's going to get spent, which we expect to happen, how much more versus how much more is saved? So it's got implications, particularly when it comes to things like stimulus. We've all heard this term stimulus so much in the last, couple of years or so, but the term's been around for a very long time in economics, and that is whenever there's a downturn in the economy and the government wants to step on the gas a little bit to sort of juice up economic activity, they'll engage in some kind of stimulus. And they'll want to know what is the marginal propensity to consume, because we want to know how does this make its way to demand. So if we can just give everybody a check for $1,400, we want to know what they're going to do with it. And the presumption is that most people will spend most of it, but maybe save some of it. Now, at the same time, there'll be some people who will save all of it, right? Who maybe have a job and were maybe not impacted at all by the pandemic, or maybe not impacted as much. It certainly didn't impact everybody equally, but what does? So as a result, but it takes into account all of those people, and those outliers are sort of subsumed by the greater whole. It's important to know because it's an extra dollar. Where's it going to go in what direction? How much they're going to spend, how much they're going to save. And so we talk about the MPC, we're basically talking about the change in consumption divided by the change in disposable income. And so again, we use the Greek delta symbol. And all this really is simply this. It's simply taking some old value, which we'll call C0, and divide the C1 is the new value. It's always new minus old, or the expected new, maybe. Expected new minus the old, or the original, or whatever you want to call it, right? Minus the DI, which will take the original DI. And that's all it is. And what does this look like to you? Well, it looks like the slope, doesn't it? And in fact, this is the slope of the consumption function. It is the slope of the consumption function, which, by the way, we represent as a linear function. Remember, slope is rise over run. It's delta y over delta x. Same deal here, MPC, which is the slope of the consumption function. Same deal with MPS. It's the same methodology, only here, it's the slope of the savings function. Oops. Slope of the savings function. Okay? And these also are mathematical complements. And so if we know that the MPC is 0.8, that is, if we give people, let's say $1,000, everybody, and and it turns out that every household spends, say, $800 of it, or enough households so that it really overwhelms those who would save it all and whatnot. Well, it must mean that the NPS has got to be 0.2, has to, because they must equal 100%. And if you would rather have the percentages as opposed to the decimals, simply move it 2 points to the right, and you have 80 and 20 and 100. So it's 80%, 20%, 100%. It's up to you. It's I would just kind of get used to looking at 80% as being 0.8, 20% being 0.2. It kind of particularly it sort of better matches the input of calculators and computers and whatnot. Even though on calculators you can hit the percentage button, all it's simply doing is multiplying it by 100 to move it 2 points to the right. That's all that's really happening there. So MPC plus NPS must equal 100% because we have already made the case that consumption and savings are mathematically complementary to one another. They have to equal one another. Okay, so any kind of change in the economy, which is important to know, what are households going to do? Now, what is interesting about this is that we're talking about from a policy perspective, what we'd like to know so that we know what kind of bang for the buck we're going to get if we're going to do stimulus. I remember in the late 2000s, toward the very end of President George W. Bush's presidency, they did another stimulus payment, and it turns out that people did not spend as much of it, but they ended up saving a lot of it. So as a result, they really did not get as much sort of bang for the buck as what was expected because it was saved. And so here's the thing with that. If you have savings, let's talk about this, and we're going to come back to an automotive metaphor here. The consumption is an injection into the economy. It's an injection into the economy. So every time you spend money, you're putting money at work in the economy. Your spending is my income, and my spending is your income. Well, maybe not yours and mine individually, but you get the idea that every time you spend money, you're creating income in the economy. Because why? Remember, the demand side of the economy must equal the supply side. That is, every time you spend, it results in the income arriving at someone else's doorstep. Income being defined comprehensively as inflows, not net profit to businesses if you're a business, but rather inflows. So it's an injection in the economy. So all consumption is an injection in the economy, whereas all savings is a leakage from the economy. So I know we can't avoid, and just we're sort of addicted to these automotive examples here, but injection, leakage. The idea of savings breaks the income and spending cycle. And you might think, well, wait a minute, not really, because, okay, let's say I put money on deposit in my bank, because maybe I don't want to spend so much this month, my expenses are lower, whatever, and so I put it on deposit in my bank. My bank is just going to turn around and lend it to somebody else. And so then they're going to go buy a new car, or, you know, it's going to fund their credit card, it's going to pay for somebody's vacation or whatever. So not really, but what I'm saying is that, well, how do you know that? First of all, it's not the case that banks lend every dollar that they've got on deposit. First of all, some of these savings, if it's a bank, and let's just say we're talking about a bank here, it's the easiest example. A bank has got to set some money aside as a reserve. It's a legal reserve requirement that they can't get out of. They've got to put money on reserve. They can't. They don't have any choice. So not all of that is available to be loaned, particularly if it's a checking account deposit. Savings account deposit's a little bit different, but checking account deposits, I think it's a 10% reserve requirement. But not only that, but what if the bank doesn't want to lend? What if the bank says, you know, well, we have more in deposits than we have to lend, and so as a result, we don't really want to lend, and we don't like the economic conditions. We don't want to lend, and there are cases in which banks don't want to lend. And I remember I worked for a bank in the early 90s in which, and I didn't find this out until I got into middle management. I found out later what was going on, but I know it was really hard to get loans approved. I mean, I had loan authority, I could make my own loans, but sometimes I had to have additional approval, and they were just turning everything down. And we couldn't really figure out why it was. And it turned out that the bank decided they would rather not lend money to people, but rather lend money to other financial institutions, because at the time, nobody thought financial institutions could do anything but honor their debts. And we sort of learned a little bit of that during the financial crisis, that maybe banks aren't always insolvent. But the interbank lending rate was so high, it was like 9%. and it was considered very, very safe, that we would rather lend 9% against a cost of funds of say 4%, make a 5% return on our money for doing nothing other than taking customers' deposits and lending it to another bank. And we're not talking about doing anything physical, we're just simply moving money around with a computer, lending money to other banks. And so as a result, you can't guarantee that banks are going to lend money. And that bank that may be borrowing may not even be looking to lend itself. It may be just simply trying to cover its own reserve requirements. In fact, that's why that mechanism exists. The federal, it's called the Fed funds rate. That's the rate the Federal Reserve just changed last week. And it really serves as a benchmark rate for all interest rates in the economy as a result. So you can't, so it's a leakage because it cuts the income and spending cycle. But think about this, just as sort of a thought experiment. What if we just take an economy, and the economy was Albuquerque, and we were on an island in the middle of nowhere, and so nothing came in, nothing left. And let's say that we all decided we weren't going to spend money, we were all going to go on strike, and so for the next month, we were just going to eat squirrels and cats and tree bark and grass, and we weren't going to buy groceries. Well, what would happen macroeconomically? Well, we'd have lots of unsold goods, lots of spoiled goods. Workers would be laid off because there's no demand for the goods, and so we'd have an unemployment problem right away. The economy would slow down. Why? Because we're breaking the cycle. What was an injection is now being withdrawn, and so now it's leaking out of the economy. Even though we're all saving a ton of money, and even if we're putting it into a bank, well, the bank's not going to lend money to people who have no desire to spend it on anything. And if they're not spending it, there's no business who's got the ability to sell anything to anybody. So as a result, because buyers are on strike, they're not buying goods. Sellers don't want to buy more goods and don't want to employ people. So as a result, an increase in savings, even though it sounds good, it's called the paradox of thrift. And that is the idea that if we all just started saving more and more and more, we would end up creating the conditions by which the economy itself would be a downturn. It's called a paradox because we've all been taught that savings is good. It's a good thing. It's a great thing to save, but it actually results in a slowdown in the economy. And so that example, as crazy as it is, eating cats and whatnot, I mean, it's still the idea that we would slow the economy down as a result by doing that, if we were just this isolated economy. And so one final thing here, because I'm about 5 minutes left, and I think the graphics on this I'll just have to wait till next week and get into that because it's going to be easier. Last thing I do want to talk about is this idea of the multiplier. And this idea that if we're interested in capturing, in particular, the marginal propensity to consume, it's so that we can make policy to adjust economic performance to better match and to close the income gap, the output gap. Same thing, output gap, income gap, whatever. So if we are at a deficit where we've got less actual performance than desired full employment economic performance, then we could close the gap. But we need to know how much, and it works through a multiplier effect. And it's this: if you make an injection in the economy by spending, and let's say it's new spending, money that didn't exist before, the government sends you a check for $1,000. And I know in years past, before we had these pandemic-related stimuli, a lot of students would kind of roll their eyes and say, yeah, like that's going to happen. Well, it does happen. The government, sometimes they do it through tax cuts and tax credits, and you get it at tax time. And sometimes you get more back to what you ever paid in through refundable tax credits, and nobody thinks anything about that. So yes, it does happen. The government can inject money into the economy through stimulus, and they can do it through tax cuts or just outright money from heaven, right? Your Uncle Joe is giving you money. People were calling him Uncle Joe last year. They started passing this out. So anyway, your uncle has given you $1,000. And so the question is, what are you going to do with it? You and every other household that is able to get that. Well, first of all, that's going to create new spending that didn't exist before, because that money didn't exist before. And so as a result, you're going to spend it. And as a result, you're going to go buy goods. And more goods are going to be sold than what were previously expected to be sold. So businesses that are going to buy more inventory to restock for those goods that were sold and to anticipate future sales, because now consumers have more money. And as a result, all along the value chain, more people are being employed. And so as a result, there's a magnification of that initial stimulus throughout the economy. It's called a ripple effect, or what's known more mathematically as the multiplier. The multiplier is simply this: it's the amplified effect of some change in the economy on the broader economy itself. It's the amplification because it doesn't, it's not like throwing a rock into a lake where it just kind of goes down, it ripples, it goes out. It gets weaker as it spreads out, right? Just like the multiplier itself does, but it nonetheless covers a much broader area. And when it comes to the multiplier based upon consumption, it's simply the inverse of the leakage. It's the inverse of the leakage. It's 1 over the marginal propensity to save. Now remember, the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save are equal to 1.0, right? Same as 1.0 here. So if this is, we'll use 80%, and this is 20%, then this has got to be 100%. So as a result, then, what is the multiplier here? It's 1 divided by 0.2, which is 5. 5 is the multiplier, which means what? If there's a change in consumption of, let's say $100 billion, right? Multiply it by the multiplier, by the multiplier of 5, we get a change in GDP of $500 billion once it's all said and done. So $100 billion, which is the change in consumption. So $100 billion, your Uncle Sam, we'll call him Uncle Sam, that's a little bit more respectful, gives you $100 billion. If the marginal propensity to save is 0.2, that is throughout the entire economy, everyone is going to save, say, 20 cents of every dollar, then it's still going to have a 5-fold increase. So the government, if it's looking to close a $500 billion output gap, it doesn't need to spend $500 billion, it needs to spend $100 billion. And so as a result, these stimulus checks, that's why the government's done, because we're at full employment, basically. There are probably no more stimulus checks coming for the foreseeable future. Every now and then I run across an article about more stimulus coming this year. I don't think it's at all going to happen. I would be shocked, but there could be something that comes up that's wacky and unexpected and whatnot. So anyway, maybe I went through this a little bit quickly. If I did, I apologize. But if you'd like for me to go over this individually with you at any time between now and Sunday, feel free to reach out to me. I'll talk more about it. But that's a good, it's a good place to cut off. So everything up to the first exam is going to cover the material covered since the beginning of the term up to this point of the multiplier. And so whatever I had in the exam, I'll just make some changes and cut that out. I think I've got you about a minute over, so I apologize. Are there questions for me about anything that I can answer about anything at all before we break for the night? Okay, well, I know these are long class sessions. I know it's always a long day doing these, and you guys are troopers for hanging in. I don't think I could do it. I really don't, but I'm glad you guys can and are hanging in there with us. So again, feel free to get with me if you like anytime between now. Well, anytime really, and I'm more than glad to help. So I'll say good night. Have a great rest of your week. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.